When you search your name, there's a lot of questions. That is good. That would be easier to know some type of probably talk to that design sort of deal. I think so, yeah. Excellent.
Is that okay?
We're going to get started right now. Thank you all so much for coming out to hear from one of our keynote speakers, Mr. Dan Gillespie. This event is part of the Tribune Publication Society and the Daily Publication Society's Journalism and Media Conference. My name is Taylor Mitchell. I'm a former McGill Daily editor and writer and a current board member. The theme of our conference this year is Journalism Redefined. How did we get here and where do we go now? The conference this year is sponsored by Montreal Press Club, Media McGill, Cafeteria La Mosaic, and David's team. So before we begin, I'm going to do an acknowledgement, just out of respect for Indigenous lands and what we've done. So we would like to acknowledge that McGill University is situated on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples. We recognize and respect these peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. So before he dives into his presentation, I'm going to give a little background info on our speaker. So Dan Gillespie, as you may know, is an award-winning foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He received his master's degree in European politics at Oxford University, and he's worked for the Times for 13 years. His career is as impressive as it is diverse. He's also written for the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, and has been based in locations such as New York, Istanbul, Prague, and now Montreal. So from Brexit to the refugee crisis, Gillespie has traced the rise of populism in Europe since the fall of communism in East and Central Europe. Gillespie has also witnessed women warriors becoming men in Albania, along with 11 terrorist attacks over an 18-month period. Sensational crime stories are also an important part of Gillespie's career. His investigation into jewel thieves known as the Bad Grandpas is currently being made into a book and a movie. So let's give a warm round of applause to Mr. Dan Gillespie.
I hope you don't mind that I thought it would be more relaxed if I sit, but is that okay for everyone? Because it's really, really hot in here. So also thank you for bearing with me with the heat. I thought I would begin, before I go into my little talk, since there's so many women in the audience. I was talking to my colleague, Catherine Porter, in the Toronto bureau of the New York Times, and she was saying, if you're going to give a talk, I really suggest that you do the Wonder Woman pose in the bathroom before you show up for the talk, when you're supposed to stand like Wonder Woman, and it's supposed to decrease stress and release cortisol and make you give a good talk. So I can confirm I was just in the bathroom doing the Wonder Woman pose, and so I'm hoping it goes well, and that I will be slightly less perplexed looking than I look on the BBC in back of me. Anyway, it's really a pleasure to be here. When the international editor of the New York Times approached me this summer and asked if I would be willing to come back to Montreal after 28 years of being away, I must admit that I was at a loss for words, which is not something I usually suffer from. I was living in London at the time, having had like a very crazy, frenetic news year. After Brexit, there had been about 11 terrorist attacks, which Taylor mentioned. I'd shadowed President Obama and Pope Benedict in Eastern Europe, and among other assignments, I'd written about high technology brothels in Antwerp. So while I was very excited about rediscovering Canada and Montreal, some of my dearest friends warned me to consider whether about writing about Canada, this prosperous slice of Scandinavia on top of the United States, that I might find it a bit bland. Was I being plucked from London and sent to a giant country where nothing ever happens? I asked myself, where the big news of the week is whether our perfectly coiffed Prime Minister is doing the Bhangra in Bombay, or whether you say baby boom or bebe boom or bonjour hi or bonjour, which was actually the first story I wrote about, much to many people's delight after I arrived in Montreal. Leonard Cohen, who grew up in Westmount, farther up the mountain than I did, used to say that he would return to Montreal to commune with his neurotic affiliations. And I really kind of knew what he meant. The person who seemed most happy about me coming home after so many years was my mom, who had still not recovered from the fact that I had skipped town when I was 18. And she would try constantly to entice me home with Montreal bagels. And like all mothers, she had this incredible ability to kind of track me down at the worst possible times during my career. So I would be like interviewing a jihadist who I'd spend like 6 months trying to get access to, and my phone would ring and I'd see, mom on the iPhone. Or, I'd be in a war zone in Central Asia, there would be bombs falling in the background, mom was calling again. And then when I did not pick up the iPhone, as we don't do, because we're away at university and we're very busy, I would get an email with the subject line, your parents, remember us, ? So also happy about my return was my 81-year-old father, who went to McGill from the age of 16 until the age of 32. Including undergraduate and medical school, internship, residency, and he'd reacted with absolute horror when I decided that I was desperate to go away to university in the US and not go to McGill. So he's very excited that I'm here today and I finally set foot in this building. He said to me, why do you need to go abroad for an overpriced artsy-fartsy degree when there's so many good universities in Montreal, like McGill? Only years later, when he would see my stories in the New York Times while on vacation in Miami, did he recover. In any case, my initial reservations about coming home quickly disappeared once I realized that Montreal and Canada were actually a cosmic opportunity for a journalist. And getting to cover your own country with foreign eyes after so many years of being away is really an amazing virtue as a journalist. In fact, it's really kind of Canada's moment, both institutionally at the New York Times, but also geopolitically in the world. The reason is that you may not realize this. Canada is actually the biggest, most important market for the New York Times outside the United States. The paper has been covering Canada since 1851, its first year of operation as a newspaper, and the nation's birth in 1867 was actually on the front page of the New York Times. Now, even more surprising, I learned this recently, half the newsprint of the New York Times was produced in a small, unpronounceable North Ontario town called Kapuskasing. And in the 1920s, the New York Times invested about $500 million to build a railroad and to have access to about 1,000 tons of newsprint from these trees in this small Canadian town, which would end up in the clamorous docks of Times Square and end up in the New York Times building, which is a very kind of interesting fact. Since there's also so many women here, it's also worth noting that I have some very big shoes to fill. And one of the most important New York Times foreign correspondents was a woman. In fact, she was a pioneering foreign correspondent called Tanya Long, who ran the Ottawa Bureau from 1952 until 1964 with her husband, Raymond Donnell. And she'd covered the Blitz in London during World War II from the 3rd floor of the Savoy Hotel, which was being bombed. And she still managed to file her stories. She covered the rise and fall of Hitler, the liberation by the Allies, the liberation of Berlin, and she was the first female correspondent to do so. And she also covered the Nuremberg trials. Then after all that, she got sent to Canada. This is sounding eerily familiar to me, where one of her first stories with her husband was whether the Canadian Maple Leaf should have 1 red maple leaf or 3. So I'm looking forward to what awaits me here. Her and her husband became such stalwarts of Canadian journalism that when they left, Lester B. Pearson, who was the Prime Minister at the time, actually gave them like a gala goodbye. So why is it such a great moment for the Times in Canada? So one reason is the so-called Trump effect. Since President Trump came into office and started ridiculing the failing New York Times, we've actually gone up to 2.5 million subscribers, and we thank Trump for that. Canadians, like the rest of the world, are trying to understand the surreal B movie that's unspooling across the border in the United States, and so it's become a very important time to read American newspapers. At the same time, because of Trump, people are looking to Canada as a liberal counterpoint to the United States in a way that they seldom have before. So, Bernie Sanders traveled here recently, and if you look at everything from healthcare policy to immigration policy, suddenly Canada matters a great deal. And while Trudeau may be buffeted by scandal at home, and then we all look at his wife's floral sari and his Bhangra moves and his kurtas that were on display during his trip last Friday, I was actually getting ready to open up a bottle of wine on last Friday, and my phone rang. Can you do a story about Trudeau's, costume changes during his trip to India and what it means geopolitically for the region? So I'm very thankful for Justin. But on a serious note, because of Trump's heralding America first, people are actually looking to Canada as the leader of the Western liberal order. Angela Merkel in Germany is slowly heading to the political wilderness. And other than Emmanuel Macron of France, who I had the pleasure of covering when I was the Paris correspondent, there really aren't that many leaders with the charisma of Trudeau. So and that's also made the New York Times very interested in Canada. Every time I mention Justin, I put him in the headline, and the number of clicks goes up exponentially. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit of my career trajectory and how a nerdy teenager from Montreal ended up at the New York Times. If there's such a thing as the Canadian dream, I guess you could say in some ways I embody it. My great-grandfather on my father's side was a fruit peddler who peddled fruit in Old Montreal. Didn't speak any English. He spoke Yiddish. He came from a shtetl in Eastern Europe. And within a few years, he brought over his entire family. My great-grandfather on my other side was a presser in the Plateau, where I now live, and has become horribly gentrified, and I think he would be shocked to see my rent today. My grandparents met when they were 10 years old in elementary school. They were sitting on opposite ends of a classroom. My grandfather fancied my grandmother and threw a piece of chalk at her and had to stay after the class and write on the blackboard, "I will not throw chalk at the girl's side." My grandfather was about 5'2" and ginger-haired. My grandmother was a very beautiful woman who fancied herself a sort of Victorian queen. And she said no for like 2 years. And my grandfather was so tenacious, he eventually broke her down and she agreed to marry him. And I think some of my tenacity as a journalist probably and possibly comes from my grandfather. And then my father was a doctor who spent his entire life at McGill, I mentioned, and then I ended up at the New York Times. When I was a teenager, I was desperate to leave Montreal and see the world. And after I went to Herzliya High School, I begged my father to send me to University of the United States. And I told you his reaction already. I was so unbearable at my lobbying every day at the dinner table that when I was in Marianopolis suffering through organic chemistry, he eventually relented and let me go to University of Pennsylvania. And the last nail in the coffin of my short-lived medical school career was when I went to do a hospital opportunity program at the Jewish General Hospital, and I was put in a colonoscopy ward. And after 2 weeks of watching colonoscopies, I resolved then and there that I'm going to be a journalist, or definitely not a doctor. So I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania, and I remember when I would spend a lot of weekends in New York City, read the New York Times in Central Park, and kind of see these amazing dispatches from Rio or Istanbul or Islamabad, and dream about being a foreign correspondent. I did an internship with the New York Times Magazine when I was 18 years old, very excited to break Watergate and do sensational journalism, and my first assignment was about foods that cause sexual arousal. And my boss, who was going on television to promote the story, asked me if I would so kindly separate all the green M&Ms into a bowl from 6 giant packs of M&Ms. And so thus began my esteemed New York Times career. After Penn and a short-lived stint as a fact-checker, I got a scholarship from the Quebec government, and I studied European politics and economics at Oxford. After Oxford, I knocked at the door of the New Statesman, which is a political and literary magazine in London, which gave the world Martin Amis, and where a lot of luminaries had worked. And the managing editor, sorry, it's really, really hot in here, so I'm trying to hydrate, because the Wonder Woman, my inner Wonder Woman is a little being diminished by the hammam-like circumstances. So the very fearsome managing editor said, kid, don't waste your time. Parliament is out of session. And I said, come on, just let me stay for like 2 weeks. And so I stayed for 2 weeks. I wrote as much as I could. And then on my last day at the New Statesman, I wrote a proposal that the New Statesman should devote an issue to Britain's tortuous relationship with the European Union, which lives to this day, as we all know. And I put it under the door of the editor-in-chief. Now, when I look back on this as a 40-something man, I'm amazed at the chutzpah and brazenness of my 20-something self to do such a thing. I don't even know if I would do it now. But it was a good idea, because basically the following Monday, a few days later, the editor-in-chief of the magazine called me and said, Dan, I love your proposal. Come back and guest edit the New Statesman. So in many ways, that was my big break in journalism, and kind of the teachable moment, I guess, is follow your dreams. Don't be afraid of taking risks, because it can pay off, and if it bombs, so what? You have nothing to lose. After the New Statesman, I ended up working at the Financial Times. I did the graduate traineeship there and beat out quite a few people. And I spent like 2 years covering the City of London, the financial sector, the London mayoral campaign. And my first editor was a woman called Chrystia Freeland, who's now the Foreign Minister of Canada. So life has really gone full circle, I should say, because Chrystia was my first boss. She was extremely demanding, never took no for an answer, but also very patient. I've since been a foreign correspondent based in London, Brussels, Paris, Istanbul, Prague, and New York. I get exhausted just reading that. And this recent move to Montreal has reminded me just how tough it is to move and uproot your entire life every 3 to 5 years, which is what you're in for if you want to be a foreign correspondent. During my last several years in London, I covered 11 terrorist attacks, as Taylor mentioned, including I covered 2 attacks in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and then the November 2015 attacks, the Brussels attacks, the Nice attacks, and on and on and on and on. In November 2015, when several 20-somethings with AK-47s opened fire on the Bataclan and just started spraying people out for a nice night on the town in Paris, I got called to the scene within a matter of hours. And it was really like one of the most horrifying things I've seen, because it was basically students your age, covered in blood, full of corpses. It was absolutely awful. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that what has amazed me every time I've covered terrorist attacks, other than the fact that the perpetrators almost always end up being people who have little relationship to religion, who discovered radical Islam via the internet, and it's the same trajectory having covered these terrorist attacks. They always seem to follow the same personal narrative. But what I wanted to say was slightly more positive, which is the resilience of the human spirit has always amazed me. And within like 10 hours of seeing where people had been killed on these terraces, I came across a group of 20-somethings, much like yourselves, having a bottle of wine, like literally in front of La Belle Équipe, which the day before had been, 20 people had been killed. And I've seen that every single terrorist attack I've covered. People are always defiantly out the next day, and luckily we in Canada don't have to grapple with that, but it's nevertheless kind of amazing. On a slightly more upbeat note, I'm going to now go through some of my favorite stories and tell you a little bit why. About a decade ago, when I was a Brussels correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, I was asked to write about the legalization of prostitution and whether it worked. So I decamped to the red light district of Antwerp, where they created this tolerance zone where prostitution was legal. And I came across this brothel called Villa Tinto House of Pleasure, which was the world's only biometric brothel. And the idea was that all the prostitutes had to swipe their fingers in a biometric scanner, and it was window prostitution, and then every 15 minutes or so the lights would go off. And that way an illegal prostitute would not be able to work in the window. And the money that was used to rent the window was used to bankroll an anti-trafficking police force. So it was a very interesting and effective policy. Only 2 blocks away, women were being sold to the highest bidder in an institutionalized form of slavery, which taught me that legalization of prostitution can work to some extent, but actually the underworld will continue to go on otherwise. A few weeks later, my parents were visiting me in Brussels, and I decided to take them for dinner in Antwerp. And we happened to walk past the red light district to go to the waterfront, and all the prostitutes started opening their windows and saying, "Hey, Dan, how's it going?" And suffice it to say, I don't think I've ever quite seen the same look on my mother's face since then. Another story that was probably the most memorable for me in my whole career was hunting war criminals in the Balkans. I I think it was 2008, I was having dinner with a friend, a very wine-fueled dinner, I should add. And at midnight, someone rang me to say that Radovan Karadzic, one of the butchers of Bosnia, who was the political mastermind of the war in Bosnia in the late 90s, and one of the people behind the Srebrenica massacre, in which 11,000 Muslim men and boys had been led to the killing fields with their hands tied behind their backs, that he'd been arrested. And could I do the story for the New York Times, the front page story for the next day? I was pretty drunk at this point. I think I'd been through like 2 bottles of wine. And I guess the other teachable moment of that story is that, what you got to do. And as a journalist, when responsibility calls, you sober up pretty quickly. I was actually like in temporary housing at the time, and I only had an internet signal if I put my computer out the window at a 45-degree angle. So I do recall that was not one of my better moments. And actually, I was so freaked out and stressed out. I actually lied. I was on a date, if you really must know. And I left. And I left. I was so stressed out. I left the woman like without paying the bill and ran to my apartment to write the story. And anyway, so it was a total fiasco. And then the next day, I had to fly to Belgrade. Anyway, I got to Belgrade and started retracing Karadzic's footsteps. And by virtue of my contacts, having spent many years covering the former Yugoslavia, I found myself having tea and cookies with one of the men who'd hid Karadzic during the 15 years when he was at large. And the guy's wife was there, and she being a very nice hostess. And I was there with another colleague of mine, and he said to me, Karadzic got arrested so quickly. I still have this computer with his legal defense and his unfinished novel on it. Would you like to see it? And all I could think was like, how can I steal this computer without getting killed by this guy who must know kung fu if he's been harboring like the world's most notorious war criminal for 15 years? So do I have a USB? Like, how the hell can I get this thing into my pocket? And my colleague and I, we were looking at each other as he was unspooling the narrative of how he was hiding Karadzic. It was very, very frustrating because we were not able to steal the computer. So in any case, shortly thereafter, we started hunting for Ratko Mladic, who was the general in Bosnia who had been on the run for 15 years. And slowly but surely, over 1 year, we discovered that the Serbian government was complicit in hiding Mladic. And as a result of my stories being published on the front page of the New York Times, Serbia's accession to the European Union was frozen. Everybody went into there was a foreign ministers meeting to decide on Serbia's future in the EU, and they all had my stories in their hand. And basically a year later, he was arrested. So that was probably one of the most gratifying, rewarding stories, because we had to do the sort of Justin Trudeau in a kurta story. But we all, also as a journalist, you can really have an impact on not only public policy, but on bringing justice. And I'd met a lot of the mothers of Srebrenica who lost their sons and fathers and brothers during the massacre. So Mladic getting arrested was probably one of the most meaningful stories of my career. Finally, I think I forgot a few. Another story that was very memorable that Taylor mentioned, the women warriors, was my story on the sworn virgins of Albania. In Albania, which is a quite poor, bedraggled country in the Balkans, people for decades lived under this ancient warrior code from the Ottoman Empire called the Kanun. And the Kanun mandates everything from hunting to finance to murder. And if you kill somebody under the Kanun, the family of the victim can take revenge and kill anybody in your family, any man that is. However, if you stay inside, you cannot be killed. So as a result, there are between 20 and 30,000 men and boys basically under virtual house arrest in Albania, and they can't go outside. So I did a story about these so-called blood feuds. But the corollary of the blood feuds is if a woman found herself in a family where all the men were trapped behind closed doors because they couldn't go outside, the only way a woman could survive socially in such a machismo, patriarchal society was to become a man. And these women would not have sex changes, but they would become men socially. And they would hunt, and they would be allowed to be in charge of finance by taking on the role of the man. But in return for being a man, they had to agree to be virgins for the rest of their lives. They had to swear an oath of virginity. And this phenomenon is known as sworn virgins. Anyway, I went trekking in the mountains of Albania, determined to find these sworn virgins who were kind of these mythical people that I'd read about in books. And much to my delight, I found 4 or 5 of them, and I wrote a story for the New York Times that ran on the front page and became kind of a little bit of a sensation because it kind of tapped into the zeitgeist At the time, there's some gender bending. It was women finding self-empowerment. And it's probably like one of the stories that I get the most emails from today, even like 10 years later. And Pasha Keki, who is the main character in my story, last time I heard when someone knocked at her door, she opened the door with an AK-47 and is not too pleased that that there's been a little bit of like sworn virgin tourism since my story came out. So I guess that's like another cautionary tale about being a journalist, which is that, if you expose your favorite restaurant, a lot of people are going to be there the next day. And so, that's part of the dynamic of being a journalist. Another story that's very, very memorable is, Taylor mentioned, I love writing crime stories. It's probably one of my favorite genres. And when I was a New York correspondent for the New York Times, I wrote a lot about crime. And I came across this one story that was quite sensational, which involved a young woman who was kind of an American dream story. She was Indian American. Her father had driven a taxi. She was now working on Wall Street. She had her own business. She fell in love with a man who said he was a policeman, but he never seemed to go out and never seemed to be policing. And she kind of got suspicious. She was smart, and eventually she decided to break up with him. He was none too pleased, and he raped her. And when she refused to drop the charges, he framed her for a series of elaborate armed robberies that never took place. So Simona was driving her car one day, and she saw some flashing police lights in the rearview mirror, and she thought maybe there'd been a break in the rape case. Instead, the police officer slapped handcuffs on her, and when she was arraigned before a judge the following Monday, she discovered that she'd been framed for these elaborate armed robberies that never took place. And what Jerry did is he convinced 3 or 4 people to give false testimony and stage fake crimes where they would say they'd been mugged at gunpoint by a petite Indian woman dressed as a policewoman. Then he would handcuff them to a pole. The false witnesses would say that she cocked her gun during the robbery, and he would put bullets on the floor. And he slow dripped the clues over a course of the year. And in the American justice system, sometimes you can be guilty before you're proven innocent. And so people believe that Simona did the crime. She spent a year in jail. The rapist and the victim switch places. So she gets out of jail, she gets put in jail. She loses her daughter, she loses her business, and she loses everything. And then eventually the whole ruse came apart. I heard about the story, and I was the first person that greeted her when she got out of jail, because I was determined to write about that story. And it was probably one of the most remarkable stories of my career. I ended up covering the entire trial, and Jerry, by the way, got 40 years in jail, including for rape conspiracy. But it was a very, very interesting trial because Simona was a very strong woman, and even though she'd been through the most horrific circumstances and the justice system had failed her, in rape cases, often juries don't always believe women. So it was a very, very interesting case. The other story that I think I wanted to mention before I end was after I arrived in London as a correspondent, shortly thereafter in March 2015, 4 roguish thieves in their 60s and 70s wanted to commit like one last career-topping heist they hoped the world would never forget, and they succeeded. So these 4 guys in their 70s and 80s, they went to London's medieval diamond district, which is called Hatton Garden, armed with diamond-tipped drills. They abseiled down the elevator shaft into the safe deposit, bored 20-inch holes through reinforced concrete on a long Easter weekend, and walked away with wheelie bins full of jewels, diamonds, and sapphires to the tune of $20 million. It was the most audacious heist in the history of Britain, and my great fortune was that it happened a couple of months after I arrived as the London correspondent of the New York Times. Now, amazingly, unfortunately for these guys, they were analog criminals in a digital age, and one of them drove his own car to the heist in London, which is probably the most CCTV ridden city in the world because of the history of terrorism. So it was not so difficult, along with license plate technology, which photographs license plates all over the city. So it was not so difficult to track down the men. They were eventually arrested, but they became working class heroes in the UK. And I am writing a book about the case. And my story was optioned by Hollywood, so it's also being made into a film with Michael Caine actually playing the lead role. Although it's not the movie, there are 4 different productions of the story, but it's not mine that's being made into the film. But hopefully it will be good for the book. Anyway, So it's kind of like Ocean's 11 meets geriatrics, is how I describe it. So people keep asking me if I'm going to be bored in Canada after all of that, to which I reply, I don't miss being woken up at midnight on a Friday and being told that there's a guy marauding across London Bridge running people over, and can I go to the scene? A little bit of Kumbaya Canada will do me just fine for a little while after that. And also, since I've been back in Montreal, I've discovered that actually Canada is a very interesting story. I mentioned that one of the first stories I did was about the Bonjour High. I've written about the identity politics of the poutine. I wrote about an indigenous chef who is as adept with a shotgun hunting moose as she is with a spatula. And I went moose hunting with her in Maniwaki, which was a really great experience. And I have a story coming out next week on the mania of Leonard Cohen in Montreal. The other thing that people keep asking me is like, what has changed since I left? And I think the answer is that things have radically changed, and some things have remained exactly the same. So when I left in 1989, when many of you were probably born or probably not even in existence yet, Quebec had been buffeted by a referendum on independence. Thousands of Anglos were leaving the province. French Canadians were agitating for their rights. Today, the poutine is a treasured national dish, even though the Quebecois will be the first to tell you that it's Quebecois. And the younger generations seem far more interested in being the next Quebecois Bill Gates than fomenting revolution. But old habits do die hard. And when I was reporting my poutine story, I learned that in order for a poutine to be authentic, the curds must squeak when you bite into them, and that this being Quebec, they should squeak in French. So thank you so much for listening, and now I'd be very, very happy to hear any questions. Yeah.
What do you do when a story doesn't actually have the sort of impact that you want it to, or that justice doesn't actually get served? Like, how do you stop yourself from taking it personally?
Well, for one thing, like working for big newspapers, the ego gets batted out of you very, very quickly. So I would say that's one way. The other thing is, in the current digital world, not every story can be Watergate, and some stories are incremental news stories, and some stories have enormous impact, like hunting a war criminal. So it's just part of the job that some of it is going to be what we call feeding the beast. And there's some stories we do fairly quickly, because, for example, there's a federal budget, I think, being announced today in Ottawa. I'm sitting here not writing about the Canadian federal budget because I made the calculation that maybe globally that's not a story that New York Times readers necessarily want to read. But I could do that story fairly quickly. It will maybe get 5,000 clicks or less, what we at the New York Times call the Valley of Death. But you have other stories, like actually my Trudeau Bangara dancing story last Friday went kind of viral and did hugely well. So part of being a journalist is you need to be flexible and you need to kind of do a little bit of both. But I think as long as you have enough home runs, then it kind of offsets some of the heart-sinking stories you have to do when your editor calls you and asks you to do a story that you really don't want to do, which happens more often than not.
You talked a lot about being in potentially dangerous situations. Have you ever found yourself in a situation so dangerous that you doubted the justification behind your work?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. In fact, a friend of mine from London rang me yesterday in a desperate fit because he's doing the City University journalism program in London where I used to teach, and he was given an assignment where they had to answer a similar question to that. What do you do if you're embedded with an opposition militia, that's fighting against your country, and you find out that they're about to ambush your country's men? Do you tell your country that they're about to be ambushed? That was like an actual question. So it's sort of a similar thing. I've had a few experiences. Many years ago, when I've written a lot about Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism and Islamic radicalization and how it happens among the younger generation in Europe, particularly when I was the Paris correspondent. But many, many years ago, I got an interview with the head of a radical Islamic organization which had not been outlawed in Copenhagen. And I was so excited to get the interview that I was a little bit dumb. And I allowed myself to be alone with this guy in a kind of community center. And I had a very kind of big, burly photographer who was with me. And somehow I got in the heat of the moment of interviewing this guy, I noticed that the big, burly guy was no longer in the room. And I had been at the Wall Street Journal when Danny Pearl was decapitated in Pakistan. And I knew him, and I was part of a team investigating Al-Qaeda terrorism cells after 9/11. So I started suddenly just getting like this pang of like, oh my God, this was probably not very smart, and looking at the door, which was closed, to kind of plan my escape. And so at moments like that, you do weigh whether, what you're doing is a good idea. I think I covered the independence of Kosovo, which there was recently the 10-year anniversary of the independence of Kosovo, but in 2008, I think it was in May. And I remember if you wanted to take the political temperature in Kosovo, you would go to this place called Mitrovica, which was divided by a bridge between ethnic Albanians on one side and Serbs on the other. And I arrived, and they were like saying "Death to America" and burning American flags and throwing Molotov cocktails, and they were rioting. And actually, this is where being Canadian and sort of looking Spanish is such a great thing, because I work for the New York Times, which I was not sort of advertising, but because I look I have a kind of very hard to place look. I can be in a mosque, I can be like in the Middle East, and people will think I'm Muslim or like Lebanese. I can camouflage as an impossible French person. So it's actually proven quite handy in my career. So when I was in Kosovo, people sort of thought I was Spanish, and I didn't really disabuse them of that. And when I said I was Canadian, it was like I've suddenly been cured of a social disease. I mean, people love Canadians, and it's actually a huge advantage being Canadian. The other thing I would mention, since it's an audience with many, many women, is my fixers, my assistants in the field, have often been women, because women are actually often better in conflict zones than men. And some women often ask me, well, can you be a woman in a conflict zone? But if there's like a frothing at the mouth group of Serbian nationalists who want to kill you, and a woman goes to talk to them, the chances are the temperature will go down. Whereas if an alpha male goes and talks to them, the temperature will go up. So actually, I found that women were much better at navigating conflict situations than men. And for that reason, among others, I really like working with women in conflict zones, because I think women have sometimes more emotion. One can't generalize, but there's a certain amount of emotional intelligence involved in being a journalist and navigating situations.
What are some of the sacrifices that you had to make for your job? And
That's
also,
really good.
On that, like some of the qualities that you would say are essential for enforcement.
The sacrificing one is quite easy. My life is riddled with the detritus of failed relationships. Part of because of that Carriage story of deploying the next day. It's very, very hard to have a personal life. Many foreign correspondents do it, and they travel with their families. And if you're lucky enough to work for the New York Times, they do pay for your children's education, and but it's very, very hard on your personal life, particularly if you're a foreign correspondent. And I spent like entire years living out of suitcases. I mean, 2008, I traveled with Obama, I traveled with the Pope. I was based in Prague at the time. I would get home, my phone would ring, go cover the Greek economic crisis, the volcanic ash cloud in Iceland. Then the president of Poland's plane exploded over Katyn. I was like going from conflict to conflict, and then I covered the Mavi Marmara disaster in Turkey. I mean, it was so exciting as a journalist, but it was very, very tough on having any sort of personal life. What was the second part of the question? I got so overridden by the first part, so I'm traumatized now. So that's also why I came to Canada. So what was the second?
What are some of the qualities that you deem essential
To being a journalist?
in your job?
I think like tenacity, like never giving up and never taking no for an answer is probably beyond sort of having a modicum of curiosity, being like engaging and interested in people. I think being tenacious is very, very important. Having a pathological allergy to making a mistake and an accuracy is so important if you want to work for the New York Times or the BBC, especially in the digital era where everything is so fast, where people are tweeting in real time. There's so much premium placed on not getting stuff wrong. And I think that's in a way, like that's probably the most important. With so much fake news and in this digital environment of fast-moving Twitter sphere and social media, yeah, making sure your facts are correct. If you have a mistake, we all make mistakes, but if you can't really afford to make too many mistakes because people are scrutinizing your every sentence, particularly in the current era where everything is so accessible on social media. They immediately attack you. Like the minute my stories go into the New York Times universe, I look on my Twitter feed, I already have people like, I hate you, you're terrible. Like the haters come out, the Trump trolls come out. When I was covering the terrorist attacks in Brussels, Trump actually attacked me in a tweet. And I had I looked at and I was like interviewing parents whose kids had been blown up. It was like pretty heavy. And I looked at my Twitter feed and I literally, because Ann Coulter then retweeted Trump's tweet, and it went like crazy, and it was like locusts descending from the heavens, like attacking me. And that was kind of cool actually, because getting attacked by Trump is not a terrible thing, but and my number of followers probably went up. But you kind of have to also, in this current age, not get too caught up in the white noise, or you can kind of go crazy because of social media being so immediate. You kind of have to keep very focused on what you're doing. Hello.
I know you covered a bit about the immigrant and refugee.
A lot, yeah.
Montreal.
A lot.
Sorry.
Abroad. Yeah, no, here not so much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just like in Montreal specifically. And Canada tends to get portrayed as sort of liberal given
Yeah.
the refugees living in the States and especially in their town. It makes us look really good. But what do you think are the most important things for people to know, mainly in the States, because the New York Times is an American newspaper, but also about the experience of refugees
In Canada?
when it comes to Canada right now?
It's a really, really good question, and I don't know. Not to promote the New York Times, but I did an episode of The Daily with Mike Barbero, which is a great podcast if you guys don't listen to it. But we did a whole podcast about Canadian refugee policy. It's a really, really good question. I must say, I really had to recalibrate coming to Montreal because I had covered the European refugee crisis for several years, both being in Italy and Malta, where the boats are capsizing, where millions of despondent Africans are coming in search of economic opportunities, and also the Syrian refugee crisis. And the right-wing populist response in Europe has been so extreme. I mean, the Hungarians have literally built a wall to keep, and sort of almost like ghettos to keep refugees out. And the far right in France has risen. The far right in Scandinavia, Denmark, which used to be a liberal bastion, now requires that refugees hand over their valuables in order to pay for their own housing. So coming back to Montreal and being asked to do a story about the refugee crisis here, because of my experience, I was like, where's the backlash? There is no backlash. One person unfurling a Haitians go home flag on the Champlain Bridge, when the refugees from Haiti started coming through. I think it's very important to emphasize that Canada, I think, comparatively speaking, is an incredibly open country. We're a country with a political culture that welcomes refugees. We're a country of immigrants. And also, the system is quite generous, based on merit. Having said all that, I do think this notion of Kumbaya Canada, where everybody's welcome, is a fallacy. And I think a lot of refugees who are coming from Haiti and soon Salvador, the countries that have lost their protected status under the Trump administration, are coming here and discovering that actually not only they don't face the threat of being deported back to the United States, they face the threat if their asylum applications are rejected of being sent back to Haiti or worse. So, and Canada, the system is very backlogged, as you probably know. There's like a wait list of 40,000 applications, and it can take 2 years to process an asylum application. But the reality is that people are coming here, and because the Canadian government is quite generous, you get a stipend each month. It's about $500, and you get a place to live, and you get free healthcare, and even French lessons, which I found amazing compared to what I know in Europe. But at the end of the day, most of those people are not going to get asylum, and they're going to have to leave. So I think Canada is much less liberal than many people think. However, the reception is much warmer and open arms than any other country, than most other countries, and I think that's a virtue, frankly.
Are there any stories that you covered that that you wish you hadn't covered them, or you regretted the broader effects that they?
That's a very good question. Well, like the Sworn Virgin one, I don't regret covering, but I was a little bit slightly concerned about this sworn virgin tourism, one of writing about like an anthropological issue that kind of turns into a, I wouldn't say a freak show, but where people sort of, someone even called me like, ask a Broadway producer wanted to turn it into like Sworn Virgins the musical. So, which I don't think probably would have been a good idea. But actually, the story that I don't regret, but I have maybe some moral qualms about, is in I think it was like 2006 when I was sent to Copenhagen to write about the funding of mosques by Libya, and to kind of to follow the money and write about the financial food chain of terrorism. And I had dinner with a friend of mine who was a Danish journalist, and he's like, Dan, that's not the story. And he told me about the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which had recently been published in Jyllandsposten, and which were starting to get traction. And he's like, that's the story, it's about culture, it's a culture war between Islam and the West, and it's about creative expression. And so I wrote about it. I wrote about it in the New York Times. I was one of a few journalists who kind of internationalized the story. And within a matter of days, there were protests in Pakistan where people were killed. There were protests in Afghanistan. And now, what is the agent of the cause effect? Is it the guy is it Fleming Rosa, the culture editor of Jyllandsposten, who decided to publish incendiary caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad as the messenger, me exposing it to a global audience? Am I responsible? Or these people who reacted in a violent way, are they responsible? So to be honest with you, I guess because I am a journalist and it's so pounded into me, I believe the public should be exposed to most things, with rare exception, if national security or someone's life is really at stake. So I don't regret it, but I remember reading those headlines of being like, holy, So so there's a moral ambivalence, and sometimes you have to be very tough and kind of a little bit relentless. Did you say?
Are there any stories internationally now that you think are not getting enough coverage in the media?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like the war in Yemen, like Africa deserves so much attention. And although Jeff Gettleman, my colleague who covers Africa for the New York, actually he's no longer in Africa, he's in Asia. The New York Times gives a lot of space to Africa, but I think like the Yemen conflict has been undercovered. The Rohingya conflict and genocide has gotten quite a bit of coverage now, but I think people were a little bit late to it, and it's sort of a moral outrage in a way that genocide is happening under the world's watch, and no one is really doing anything until it's too late. So I think that story is undercovered. I think like those are the two that jump into my head. What do you think?
I think Yemen.
Yemen?
Yeah.
Any others come to your mind?
That's the main one.
Anyone else?
I think Kurdistan.
Kurdistan? What about
All in Kurdistan.
all of Kurdistan? Well, that's an interesting, as someone who covered the Kurdish issue a lot when I was in Istanbul, when I was the Turkey correspondent, I'm very support coverage of the Kurds. I think it's been getting more and more now because of the involvement in the Syrian conflict, but for sure. I'm also curious, selfishly, what Canadian stories are not getting covered that should be getting coverage in the New York Times, if anybody has suggestions.
Indigenous
Pardon me?
oppression, continued indigenous genocide.
Yeah?
Mexican murdered indigenous women.
Yeah? Yeah. That's been getting, absolutely. Anyone else? Okay, questions? I think someone else had a question.
Well, my question was, what stories in Canada are you most excited for?
Oh, well, not to sound like I'm following on this gentleman's comment, but I was really so impressed and amazed by the Indigenous issue, the kind of the search for reconciliation Canada-wide, but at the same time, the institutionalized racism, stigmatization, and of course with the Bushi case, it's impossible not to understand the moral indignation. And also just from a purely experiential perspective, I had such a great time moose hunting in Maniwaki and meeting this incredible Indigenous chef who was going back to her roots and kind of using her cooking as a kind of cultural renaissance, and kind of liberating herself culturally. So I'm super excited by this aspect of Canada, which growing up, I must confess, I was super ignorant about. We were not taught very much about Indigenous issues when I was studying history in Montreal. I don't recall. I remember learning, that about the fights with the Iroquois and the Algonquins, like in some of the textbooks. But so I think that I'm very, very excited about. I think understanding Canada through food is something I'm super excited about. As someone who's covered nationalism and populism a lot, it's very interesting coming home here. It's not that I'm desperate to rediscover that particular issue since I grew up here and know it all too well, but it is interesting as a petri dish to look at how Canada has evolved. When you look at what's happening in Catalonia and you look at other nationalist movements at the moment, Quebec is kind of an interesting tale and paradigm of how how a country can actually, how a multicultural, multilingual country can actually work. And if I can do a little plug while I'm up here, because maybe you guys and women will have some ideas. I'm actually, in March, I'm going on a road trip, an interactive road trip across Quebec, where I'm going to be going to 5 different places that tell 5 different things about what it means to be Quebecois and Quebecois identity. And it's actually going to be a New York Times experiment, because instead of doing traditional journalistic dispatches, I'm going to kind of do Instagram stories. I'm going to travel with a video documentary filmmaker who's going to like film me Anthony Bourdain style. I'm going to do like Facebook Lives. I'm going to engage with people on Twitter. And then I'm going to kind of write in real time. And I'm going to let the audience kind of guide me as to who I should meet and what I should see. So I'll be talking more about it in the next couple of weeks. But if anyone is interested, you can follow me on Twitter and you can follow me on my journey. And if you have any suggestions, it's going to start off in Montreal. And then I'm going to go to Maniwaki to write about Indigenous issues. Then I'm going to go to Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, which is a bit like Trump's Rust Belt in Quebec because of globalization and the fall of the manufacturing sector. Then I'm going to go to Quebec City, and I'm going to go to Hérouville, which you may recall 10 years ago, the town council issued an edict telling all immigrants that they should not burn or stone women. The only problem was there were no immigrants in the town. So I'm going back like 10 years later, and it was kind of an international scandal at the time. So my idea is to go back 10 years later and see if attitudes have shifted. Any more questions? Go ahead.
Just kind of on the tail end of that question. You were talking about the Trump effect earlier.
Yeah.
And how Canada's kind of like a liberal kind of effect.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Trump effect undermines the efforts made by Canadian media to hold the government accountable for the issues surrounding Indigenous suppression and on the Canadian side?
Interesting. What do you see as the connection between the Trump effect and Indigenous fights by Canada?
Personally, I think there is a lot of comparison going on, so maybe Canadians don't feel too good about
Oh, that's interesting. Like we feel so good about ourselves because compared to Trump and his sort of right-wing populism, we are so like right on and politically correct.
A lot of those topics like American politics.
No, I see what you're saying. I do think there is, beyond the sort of Trump effect of newspaper circulation going up, I think there is the Trump effect of numbing our sense of what is right and wrong. And the moral compass has been kind of pushed in such crazy directions on women's rights, on gender rights, on gun control. And again, it's true. I think we have to guard against the kind of Trumpization of political culture where everything you become a little numb because as a journalist, I mean, you read the headlines every day and it seems so nuts. You can barely get your head around it, let alone trying to kind of keep. So no, I think it's a good point, and I think it's something that everybody has to kind of guard against.
Well, for you working at the New York Times, having sort of put niche on, do you think that there's something that you can do working for the New York Times in Canada to draw maybe more attention to the issues or Canada's faults?
To Canada's faults? No, absolutely. And actually, my gut as a journalist is always to find the counterintuitive story, is to find the story that slays the sacred dog. And so I'm kind of tired about reading these stories. As much as I think it's important, I don't want to do like another 1,000 stories about, Canada policy towards Syrians. I don't know. I'm determined to try and find the dark side of Canada. Maybe it doesn't exist, but I think it does, because there's a dark side everywhere. And I think journalistically that'll be more interesting for me, but also interesting for Americans and for our global audience.
How are you able to balance like mainstream with the counterintuitive in your head? Like personally, how has your moral compass been influenced by all of your work abroad?
Ooh, how has my moral compass been influenced by all my work abroad? Wow. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by the question? I'm not sure I understand.
Of course. I think that once you travel to like other cultures, once you like, leave home for a long time, you kind of come back with those foreign eyes, like as you mentioned. So,
nice.
I would say like you might feel a bit disillusioned with Canada, or
Oh.
no, maybe you don't feel as
Like how I feel coming back to Montreal. Oh, it's incredible culture shock. And when I first came here, my stuff hadn't arrived yet. I think if I'm answering the question correctly, if that's your question. But when I first arrived in Montreal, having been away for 28 years, my stuff hadn't arrived yet, like on the boat, because it was sent from London. So I was staying at my parents' house. Good idea that was. And actually, they pissed off and went to Miami like a few days later. So I was like literally like sleeping in my childhood bed and then in their bed. And I literally felt like, oh my God, the last 30 years of my life are one giant hallucination. And it was extremely, extremely, extremely off-putting and destabilizing. But the great virtue of it is then I found a place on the plateau, and I've seen like the way Montreal has become. I mean, Montreal was always cool, but I think it's even much cooler than it was 30 years ago. And like the plateau neighborhood, for example, like, it's so, French and English, it's all become like a big hodgepodge. And so it's really cool to be in your own city, but feel like a foreigner. And I think, and then sort of to address the beginning of your question, I think because of all my experience abroad, covering so many stories in so many countries, covering the high-tech brothel, where the head of the brothel shows up, is a transsexual prostitute who one day shows up as George, and the next day shows up as Joyce, or meeting sworn virgins in Albania. I mean, I've lost all kind of prejudices. I think in some ways we all have our prejudices, but I've seen everything, I think, or close to it. So I would love to be shocked, but like nothing can surprise me in that sense. So I think it makes you really open-minded, and because of the spectrum of humanity that you've seen. And I think the recalibration to Canada is like, in a way, we're kind of like the perfect country. We are like a slice of Scandinavia on top of the United States, and that's great for like public policy and for life. But as a journalist, it's problematic because it's hard to do good news stories all the time. So I think that's going to be part of the challenge of working here. But that's when the sort of Canada as a social, economic, and political model becomes the story.
One more question.
Only one more?
I'm sorry.
Oh, I don't know who to choose. Too much pressure here? Oh, did you already ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
No,
sorry.
you're right.
Can we do two? And I will be less long-winded.
Sure, 2 questions.
Okay.
I couldn't say.
Okay, I don't want to be.
So you've seen the landscape of like journalism change over
Yeah.
the last few decades, and I think that a lot of what like young journalists are afraid of is that like giant like bastions of journalism like the New York Times are very hard to break into. So how do you think like the sort of like the nature of journalism and the demographics of journalism have changed with the new generation? And, like, what advice do you have for new journalists?
Sure. I'll try and I promise to be concise, because that's not an easy question. I mean, the New York Times was always hard to break into, and I think that, that will never change, and people who are tenacious and talented and determined will get there. I think the big difference, obviously, from when I started off, is that when I started off, you just had to like write a story and file it, and then it would appear in the newspaper the next day. Now you have to like write a story in real time, and you have to write like 7 versions of that story, and then with your left hand, you have to be like doing a Facebook Live. And then with your right hand, or maybe you don't have enough hands, so with your foot, you have to be tweeting. And then you have to be like translating it into French. So I mean, being able to multitask and having video skills and digital journalism skills, I think is great. And then having language skills, like speaking Mandarin or Arabic, is a huge advantage. And having language skills in somewhere maybe a bit more off the beaten track, I would say. And then the most important thing is that when you apply for a journalism job is you need clips or something to show for yourself. So I think that, if it's at all helpful, that would be my advice. And then
The last bit of keynote was in who would you say is the most politically influential person?
I didn't hear it. Who's the most politically influential person in Europe? You're British? Well, I would say it's, and very nice to see it. I almost feel like an honorary Brit since I spent so much of my formative years in the UK. I would dare say that Theresa May is vehemently not, and nor is our dear friend Corbyn. But the most powerful person in Europe at the moment, I would say, I mean, the obvious answer would be Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany. And the thing is, she is, in terms of geopolitics and economics, Germany is still the most important European country. And geopolitically, Germany still punches above its weight. She's a little bit of a lame duck because she's heading towards the political wilderness. She's having trouble forming a coalition. And I think she's been around so long. I think she's going to like her 12th year, whatever it is. So arguably, now I would say that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, is probably the upstart who, in a way, is because of Britain's brilliant decision to leave the European Union, otherwise known as Brexit. You know, Britain, you know, was such an important country in Europe, but has been relegated to the sidelines. And with Germany kind of not taking that leadership role, Macron, who's a neoliberal, who's reforming the labor market and has a much more centrist approach than any of his predecessors, I think he's the one who's most primed to kind of be the leader in Europe. He's also young and he's dynamic at a time where people are looking for change, and the opposition in France is in the political wilderness. So I would answer, I think, Emmanuel Macron.
Thank you all so much for coming. Given all of Dan's stories, we could probably be here for 2 more hours.
Probably.
But unfortunately, we're going to have
That we'd all die of heat exhaustion.
However, we are having Michel Cormier. He's giving a presentation on foreign correspondence in this room. So if you'd like to stick around, feel free. Have some refreshments. And just one last little plug. On Wednesday, we're having a mixer in Gertz at 8 p.m. So you can network a little bit, ask for some more stories. And we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Oh, you were showing overheads. I didn't realize. How cool.
Thank you so much.
No, thank
I
you.
was Nathan, editor for the Legal Tribune.
Oh, congratulations. Let me give you a card. Great.
Worked last summer at Wall Street Journal. Thank you.
Oh, did you? Where?
Marcus desk.
In New York.
In New York, yeah.
How was that work for the journal?
I know.
How was it?
It was good. I'm going back to Barron's.
Nice.
Graduated.
Oh, you already have a choice?
Yeah.
Congratulations. It's a very good publication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, it's awesome. So where are you American?
I grew up in New York.
So you're going to go back to
Yeah, so I lived with my parents until I started pulling income.
So that's great that you already have a choice.
Yeah.
Ours is very good.
Just not about that too much.
So congratulations. Actually, I started my career.
What is it? It splits out the head.
It's a very good. Right now, I can definitely like Irish.
No, I mean, it's
Studying
that
that
makes
makes
it
it
fun.
right on my
It's awesome.
The red.
Good to meet you. Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure.
It's been filtering from.
Oh, yeah? Nice.
That was great.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'll meet you downstairs.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Hey, I'm actually also like a Montreal
Turkey?
local.
Kurdish?
No, Jew, Montreal local
Oh,
Jew.
okay, cool.
Okay. In China and US and everything.
Okay.
And now back here for now, but.
So you know the culture shock.
But I actually was wondering if I could get your, is that if you give
Sure,
out
sure.
your info? Because
Yeah, yeah.
I'd love to share. I'm also like more involved with like radical left type communities.
Wow, okay.
And
Oh, you should be my friend. He's my
I was going to ask a question, but I didn't want to take time away. I'm not a student here. I was
Okay,
like,
no worries. It's nice to have some
figured the
long
journalist students.
Yeah, no, sure. Feel free.
But anyway, maybe I'll ping you an email or something.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. Really awesome talking.
Thank you.
Good to hear your perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
feel strange to be on the other side of the camera as a journalist?
Well, yeah, it took me a little while to get used to it. Get quoted and say, I didn't say that. You have to be very, very careful on how you phrase what you want to say so it's clear for people. Right. Short sentences. So what's your plan? What year are you in?
Third year.
Third year, okay. One more?
Yep.
And after that?
Honestly, not sure.
Are you going to try to get into McLean's or?
Yeah, but hopefully if I can get into that could be a nice steady transition into employment.
Yeah.
If not, law maybe, just because I feel like I love any sort of policy discussion in my classes, and I feel like there's actually a lot of transitionability between like journalism and law. It's all about like finding the stories, finding the truth. Yeah.
That's good. You like Montreal?
I love it. My mom's Quebecois, so she was really happy that I chose to come back to East Canada. I love poutine so much. Such a
I'm sure you're well served here.
I have a family friend who's from Montreal. And he's also he's like a businessman, and he's traveled a bunch of different countries, and he said Montreal's the best goddamn city on earth. Do you have any thoughts on like the best cities?
Well, depends where if it's city you want to live in.
That's a good question.
Of Barcelona and Lisbon. Paris was kind of nice to live in. I love Paris. Great London.
Right.
Paris. But this is a great place for compared to the services, cost of living, culture,
Right.
access to actually religious. This is pretty much. This is pretty good. What's it going to do? Drive out there.
Yeah, McGill's beautiful. Yeah, I also like where McGill is located too. Like the fact that it has its own campus, but also right in downtown is best of both worlds.
It's a great location. It's a great university.
Actually, we had a recent discussion about university, and we were talking about experiential learning. And just in our discussion, it just seems like McGill's kind of lacking on that. I feel like it sometimes focuses on the research prestige a little too much. Maybe not the best for like just undergrad. Just hard me a bit.
The universities tend to be like that too, I guess. It's still a great degree.
But I love working with the Tribune, so I don't want to go anywhere else.
So if I have a few questions from the audience.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
It's like generally the schedule is that this thing about 45 minutes, but we can change our time.
Okay.
They told me 40 minutes, but I will change that unilaterally based on how we do it, and then we can
Right.
take the questions from the audience.
Well, I have to leave at 8, so it's.
Right.
If you want to stop at 1:45 or something.
For sure.
What time is it?
Yeah.
5 after?
Yeah. If you think we should go to the Q&A, let me know, and I'm
Okay, sure.
perfectly happy to change that.
Okay.
We can like sense out the atmosphere through. It's getting dry. We can go through.
Yeah.
Not sure if we're going to go. Holly, are we good? Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel on foreign correspondence. This is part of the Tribune Publication Society and the Daily Publication Society's Journalism and Media Conference. The theme this year is Journalism Redefined. How did we get here, and where do we go now? We'll be exploring these two topics as we look into investigative journalism globally and how to best prepare for the oncoming tech tsunami. This conference is brought to you by Montreal Press Club, Media at McGill, Cafetiere La Musique, and David's Tea. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that McGill University is situated on the traditional territories of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples. We recognize and respect these peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. My name is Calvin. I'm a news editor at the McGill Tribune, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Michel Comier. Thank you for joining us.
Sure, thanks.
Mr. Comier is the Executive Director of News and Current Affairs at Société Radio Canada, the French network of Canada's public broadcaster. In 30 years of journalism, he has been a parliamentary correspondent for Radio Canada and CBC, bureau chief at the Quebec National Assembly, and foreign correspondent in Moscow, Paris, and Beijing. He has reported from 40 countries and was one of the first reporters into Afghanistan after the 9/11 attack. He has interviewed Vladimir Putin, Hamid Karzai, and Benazir Bhutto, to name a few. As news director, his priorities are to maintain and develop the credibility and reach of public service journalism and to successfully make the transition from traditional media to digital platforms. Our timeline here is that we'll take about 40 minutes doing set questions, and then we'll move into Q&A. We can change that as we go.
Sure.
But I guess before getting into the specifics of your long career, could we just start with what interests you in journalism and in these political aspects of it in particular?
Well, I always wanted to be a reporter, so I never aspired to be anything else. So that's basically it. I did an undergrad degree at Carleton University in journalism, and then a master's in poli-sci at Laval in international foreign policy studies. And basically from then on worked at Radio Canada and CBC.
In that case, what drew you into reporting? Like, what does it mean to you?
Well, it's just to be there where stuff happens, and basic curiosity, I guess.
Yeah, good excuse to get involved with it.
It's a great way to see the world too.
So speaking of seeing the world, what was on your mind when you decided to be one of the forerunners into Afghanistan, and did it live up to your expectations?
Well, I was scared of getting into an old Soviet helicopter to start with. But we had, I was the Moscow correspondent for CBC and Radio Canada back then. So that when 9/11 happened, the only way into Afghanistan was through Tajikistan, which is a small former Soviet republic north of Afghanistan. The Northern Alliance was still controlling about 15% of the territory. The Taliban were right close and closing in. So the only way in was through Tajikistan. So all their correspondents in Moscow, it was a natural destination to get there.
Right.
So, but we all thought that we had to get in there to first, see what the situation is, and it's your natural instinct, right? You can't just rely on people giving you secondhand accounts of what is happening on the ground, and of course, we were expecting some kind of response from the United States. So we wanted to be inside the country to see when this would happen, if it did happen.
Right. And speaking of getting in there, how did you come across sources when you were in Afghanistan?
Well, it's a good question because you don't have, press attachés really. It's life at its rawest, and we did find some people who actually spoke a bit of English to translate for us.
Right.
Eventually we switched to a Russian translator who had studied in Moscow, and that life became much more easy then because we kind of figured out that the young man who was translating in English for us wanted to give a good image of his country. So every answer was kind of positive. When we changed translators, we figured out that the situation was quite different or more complicated. But you try to just tell the story of what's in front of your eyes because there's a lot of disinformation. Right. And when you don't know stuff, well, you actually say so, basically.
Did you pick up any languages during your times abroad?
So workable Russian, a bit of Chinese, not much though.
And speaking to locals on the ground, would you say that their rhetoric was different from the officials you talked to? Could you see, how did you deal with this misinformation?
You mean generally or in Afghanistan? Or?
Either or.
Well, the best way to actually get to a story is actually try to find some ordinary people who actually live the life.
Right.
I remember I can give a couple of examples. I remember when Putin was trying to get elected in Russia, and the whole election was kind of rigged. We all knew that. So we went to a couple of rallies in the surrounding cities around Moscow, and the whole thing was the depth of support for Putin, which was of course manufactured. He dominated all the media, discredited all his opponents and everything. So I remember we went to Yaroslavl, which is a small industrial belt city outside Moscow. And after the meeting, I said to Tanya, our fixer, well, let's try to find some real people. So we just drove around and got into this whole apartment where the roof was leaking, and we ended up, meeting Nadezhda, who was a 60-year-old woman who'd lost her job in making tents for the army a long time ago, and her friends. And I remember she had put pots and pans on the floor to stop the water from going onto the floor. And I asked her if she was going to vote in the elections, and she said yes. She says, "Who are you going to vote for?" She says, "Putin." She says, "Putin? Your roof is leaking. You're out of a job. You can barely live, and you're going to vote for Putin." She says, "He's a great man. If he knew I existed, he would help me, but he just doesn't know I exist." So through that little story, you could see the whole depth of the penetration of Putin, propaganda machine. So you can tell the story with a political scientist who will say that, but it doesn't have the same resonance as when you actually manage to go and get it from the people.
And then sharing a story like that, what sort of audience did you have in mind? Was this trying to relate it to the Russian people, to a global audience? How did you connect with the story?
No, but we're trying to tell the story for Canadians.
Right.
I was working for CBC and Radio Canada, both French and English. And it's difficult in a 2 or 3 minute piece to convey the whole complexity of situations like that and not fall into cliches. So if you can find somebody who actually embodies what you're trying to say in simple words or simple realities. This woman, in a few words, had told the whole complexity of the relationship with Putin and the Russian people. So you start with her,
right,
from the particular, then take a step back and do the political equation, of course. And then you get back to the significance of the story. But it's, I remember sometimes it's hard because realities are different. I mean, when Putin was going after the oligarchs back in 2000, soon after he got into power, he had arrested this guy named Guzinski, who owned the major television station that was critical of Putin. He was also a crook, corruption, and he basically stole money and everything. So I tried to tell the story of this guy who was a crook but a symbol of democracy at the same time for the Russians. And I remember my foreign editor called from Toronto and said, "I don't get it, Michel. Is this guy a good guy or a bad guy?" So he's both. He said, "We can't have that in the story. It's too complicated. We can't deal with that concept. So find something else." So sometimes it's too complicated. Yeah, it is complicated to tell stories.
Sure.
But you try to relate it to an audience that's sitting here in Saskatoon, Vancouver, who've never been to Russia, for example.
Right. And I suppose looking at the discrepancy between local reporting and the more international political view, we can kind of see that in hindsight, celebrating the overthrow of the Taliban government in 2001 was a little premature.
Yeah.
Did you get the sense of that while you were reporting?
Well, when I got to Afghanistan, we were expecting the American invasion, which came quite quickly. And then, as you probably know, the regime just fled into the mountains into Pakistan, and the war was over before it started, aside from a few pockets of resistance. And we kind of had a feeling, because we had all read the story of Afghanistan, that, it's a story of invaders coming in and then getting into guerrilla warfare and then losing the battle and going back home. The British, the Russians, the Soviets. And I remember leaving Moscow and interviewing old, veterans from the Soviet War who told us, don't tell the Americans not to go in there because they're going to lose like we did. But at the same time, the American invasion was so quick and so overwhelming that, I think not many people, not many journalists thought that actually this was going to be the same result, right? Of course, something happens. If the Americans hadn't left in 2003 to invade Iraq, maybe, part of the situation would have been different. But you have an inkling that, things are too easy, but you can't really judge either. In hindsight, of course.
Right.
Ended up being that.
Going back to Russia, we always hear about securitization of North America after 9/11. Could you give us a perspective on what the reaction was like in Russia following the attack?
Yeah, that was quite interesting. I remember we were in a small town in Anapa in southern Georgia, in southern Russia when the attacks happened, so we had to fly back to Moscow to do a reaction. And flying back into Russia, into Moscow, what the Russians had actually done is close the airspace because they were afraid that the Chechens would copycat the attacks. That was the first Russian reaction. We managed to land in Moscow. And then I remember, going down the street, and a lot of poor Russians were trading in their dollars for rubles because they thought the dollar would actually sink because of that. So, of course, I remember Tanya, our fixer, telling the Russians, don't do that. It's going to drop tonight, but in a couple of days, the value of the dollar will go back up. But these people wouldn't have anything in that, so they were trading in their dollars at half the price, half the worth. And of course, 2 days later, the ruble, the dollar went back up.
Right.
So you had that, and then you had some Russians who actually went to the American embassy to give red carnations in solidarity. But at the same time, when you interviewed them, they said, well, now the Americans will know what it's to deal with terrorism. So there was kind of not necessarily sympathy or empathy, but kind of we told you so kind of feeling. And but then Putin, of course, was very happy that the Americans were into Central Asia to be the policemen of Afghanistan, because of course they were always worried about infiltration of Islamists from Afghanistan and other places. So it was, all in all, it was a good deal for Putin.
And a little bit of a side note, but you mentioned having to fly to Russia for reactionary shot. Is that common as a foreign correspondent? They would just send you to various countries and you get a phone call at like midnight saying, hey, we need you to go check in on...
Oh yeah. You're always ready to actually leave and actually go anywhere. That's part of the job.
Was that difficult or exciting?
Well, it's exciting for you. It's kind of it's kind of a bummer for your wife and kids when especially I missed most of my own birthdays because there was always something happening, and these crises seem to happen often when you're on holidays. So, but it's always exciting to get on a plane to cover a story.
What story would you say you're the proudest of? Or one of the proudest of?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's the stories that like the one I just told about getting to the truth through actually the lives of people. When I was in China, it was very hard to actually get people to talk, and for good reason, because they're under surveillance, and to criticize the government can land you in jail for not much. But there was this guy who was so fed up he wanted to talk, and he had his house stolen by some developer who was in league with some party official, so they could build their own villas and sell them for a lot of money. And he had tried to stop the bulldozers from destroying his house. When that didn't seem to work, he doused himself with gasoline and set himself on fire. So he survived that, and we met him at a hospital where he was recovering, and he told us he was so desperate, so angry that he wanted to talk. And then we told him, well, you realize what you're up against. He says, I don't care. I really want my story to be out there. So we took him back to the field where his house was. I remember there was a rare snowfall in Beijing that day, so he couldn't find the place of his house. Eventually we found there was a foundation was still left under the snow, and he still had photographs of that. And through that story, you could tell a lot about the whole relationship to the people, the party, the corruption. And this guy said, I believed when Deng Xiaoping told us to make money that it was not bad. It was good to do that. So he says, I built a small enterprise, built a house, and now that I have that taken from the government. And in that story, you had the last 20 years of China's political and economic development. So this is the kind of stuff that stays with you.
Right. And having been to Russia and China, would you say that there's something about post-communist countries that appealed to you?
Not really. I was one of the few who actually could report in French and English, and those were the two postings that actually had that.
Right.
But at the same time, it does get you out of your, not only your comfort zone, but your whole, the whole, I guess, system of beliefs that you have.
Right.
And the whole notion of, how do you do journalism and keep up your own standards in societies like that is always a challenge. And you cannot make compromises on the journalism that we practice here. So that was complicated. I remember doing a story on the Kursk submarine sinking. That was one of the great tragedies of the first Putin mandate. And we're doing an anniversary piece on this, and there was one sailor in the submarine who had actually written a note to his wife before he died, and when they eventually opened the sub, they found the note in his pocket, which showed that they'd been alive for like 4 or 5 days more than what the government was saying. Big scandal. So we called up the young widow and asked her for an interview, and she says, well, just a minute, they'll have to speak to my agent. Her agent. So the agent comes on, Denise, and he says, well, it's $200 for the interview, and another $100 if you want a tape of the wedding. He says, well, we can't pay. We don't pay for stuff like that. Well, says you're a bit naive because everybody else is paying. So we couldn't make that compromise. In the end, it was a better story because we ended up interviewing the parents of the sailor who didn't ask for money and were a better story than she was because they were accusing her of actually making money off the funeral and the death of their son. And these were people who couldn't understand this kind of new Russian economy because they were old-style communists who really had a hard time, living in this new Russia. So you had the whole contrast between the generations, of course, of this. And at the same time, you could hardly blame the young widow from trying to make a few bucks off interviews with foreign journalists because she hadn't been paid the back wages that she was due by the government because of her, or the insurance. So, and it makes you want to judge people less also. You always leave with a bunch of certainties, but you come back a lot more tolerant of human, failings and different standards.
In contrast, were there any times where you saw something that really relatable humanly in a foreign correspondent? Just an instance where you felt like, yeah, we're all humans. This is human nature.
Well, yeah, and in terms of disaster, when you get into a disaster zone, earthquakes or stuff like that, then the real humanity comes out, and sometimes you're just a witness to this. I remember, and scenes are just amazing. I remember this in Sichuan. There was a huge earthquake, 80,000 people dead. The whole sides of mountains had fallen into the into the valleys, and whole villages were actually taken down with them. And, so we were driving around trying to get, find some story, and we just saw this guy coming down the mountain with a chair strapped on his back, with his father sitting on the back of the chair. And so we interviewed the guy, and he says, we're the only 2 survivors of the village. Our house is the only one that was not taken down with the earthquake. And that, that connects you with a different kind of existence. I remember this family also, who'd lost everything. They were trying to rebuild the house after a few months in the earthquake, and they'd lost their pig, they'd lost everything, the house. So they rebuilt the house with a few stones that were, part of the rubble, and had a makeshift kind of shelter. So they told us their story. It was, around noon, and then they said, well, would you like to stay for dinner, for lunch? And there were 6 of them in the family, and they had a cabbage about this big, and that was lunch for everybody. And we said, well, no, that's all you have. We can drive to the other town and get lunch. But for them and for their dignity, it was more important for us to accept part of that cabbage than to actually refuse it.
Right.
So we stayed and actually shared that cabbage. And you get really, contrasted feelings, because at the same time you see, we're depriving these people of the little they have to eat, but at the same time, if we had said no, it was worse probably.
Right. Of course.
Because they felt that if they could do that, they still had some dignity. So it puts you in all kinds of situations that journalism school doesn't prepare you for, and but that's the beauty of the job too.
Right. I had experience in rural Uganda where some kids gave us a chicken, and beet's surprisingly rare, so it's really hard to know what to do in such a situation.
Yeah.
Though seeing the governments like Putin's failing its people, I imagine that'd be difficult to be impartial. How does one go about still presenting a good news story?
Well, it's quite easy. I mean, it's not that you don't have feelings, but you don't. It's 2 minutes on the air that you don't share them with the rest of the country. I mean, you report, and reporting is being witness to stuff, and if people are intelligent, if they see what you see and you portray it, in a truthful fashion, they will, react to these realities. If you start expressing opinions on everything that revolts you in the world, it's not going to stop, right?
Right.
So that's part of being a journalist, and but a lot of us, actually it happens pretty often that some journalists will just leave the business and go into humanitarian work because they feel it's more useful, and I respect that. But the distance you keep from those subjects doesn't mean you're indifferent to it, but you stop just short of judging the situations. But if you report on it, I think it does a job too.
Have you been interested in going to humanitarian work or politics, or is journalism a career for you?
No, I mean, especially not politics. No, I mean, I've kind of, well, you're a journalist one day at a time, and then you end up at my age and say, that's all I've done. So, it's like, but it's a great life. It's a great life.
I imagine it's a great life if you can interview such famous figures as Vladimir Putin, Hamid Karzai, and Benazir Bhutto. Could you share what it's like to just sit face to face with such a legendary figure? How do you adjust their interview policy? What's it like?
Well, it's quite intimidating, especially with Putin, because well, it was not just me doing that. I mean, we had the reason we got an interview with Putin at the Kremlin is that because he was coming to Canada on an official visit, so they usually give an interview to the correspondents who are in the country. Otherwise, forget it. CBC. So it was me and 2 journalists from the Globe, one of them was Krista Freeland, now she's a foreign minister. She went to politics.
Yeah, great.
And Paulo Newton, who was at CTV, was now at CNN. So, but we had to prepare the interview with the press service of Putin, which we would never do. But either it was discussing the topics with the press attaché or not having an interview. So we kind of discussed this and said, well, we'll have to make that compromise. And I remember the press attaché saying, well, do you really want to talk about Chechnya? And we said, well, it's hard not to. He said, well, just to warn you, he may just get up and leave if you bring it up. So, okay, we'll take our chances. Well, we asked a question and he didn't leave the room, of course. But I mean, Putin is a very, his mind is like a computer. He's a very, intelligent, prepared man, and you got the feeling that he wouldn't like to play poker with him. He has this steely, look, and is very in control. And he had even, prepared, in case we asked about hockey, which is a cliche question. Hockey. Canada, Russia, hockey is kind of natural. We didn't ask a question, but then he had a prepared answer on the number of Russians who were playing in the NHL. So at the last time we said, well, would you like to add anything? The last time said, well, there are a lot of Russians in the NHL. So really, I didn't know there were. I knew there were a lot. I didn't know there were like 118, right? So that's the kind of preparation they'd made for this interview. So it gives you a glimpse into, I won't say the soul, but to the person. Benazir Bhutto was you know who Benazir Bhutto was? The former leader of Pakistan. Well, she was exiled and came back in 2007 or 7 to Pakistan to be a candidate in the elections. And as soon as she stepped off the plane, some terrorists tried to assassinate her. There was a bomb in her parade, and like 150 people died. So we were there covering the story, and we asked for an interview with her. It took a couple of days, but she actually said yes. So, but I remember the first thing she said coming into the room, and she's a very charismatic woman, a woman of the world. She studied at Oxford, at Harvard, and had all the diplomas, and and that kind of worldly air about her.
Right.
And she came in and she says, You'll have to speak loudly because I'm still I'm still suffering from the effects of the explosion. Those were her first lines, right? This was kind of a movie. And she was very generous, though she'd been, a bit injured and was a bit hard of hearing that day. And the thing is, you sense in interviewing her that she knew she was going to be assassinated. And there was a fatalism about her that she understood and kind of accepted this as a kind of political fate. Of course, her father had been assassinated by the army, and her brother had been killed also, political assassination. But it's as though that she felt she was ready for that fate, and she couldn't escape it in a way. And that was it's feelings you get into interviewing people, and that was quite, for me, one of the most troubling experiences I've had in interviewing anybody. And of course, 2 months later, she was assassinated by another suicide bomber. And so Hamid Karzai, the Afghan president, was more of a laid-back guy.
Right. When did you interview him?
I mean, twice in 2003 and 2004. When the Canadian mission, was in Kabul. I went there, spent quite a lot of time there. So we just asked for an interview with Karzai. And sometimes the way it happens, sometimes chance plays a part of it. It was hard to get Karzai. He was very busy. And but my producer, who was based in Washington at the time, who is now a correspondent for us, Marie-Ève Bédard, if you've heard of her, she's in Beirut, great reporter. just happened to meet one of Karzai's people that she had seen in Washington, because he was a political consultant there, and came back to Afghanistan to try to rebuild the government. So she says, I don't know what his name was, but she says, I've been asking for an interview. Can we get an interview? She says, just give me a couple of days and we'll get the interview. So the official channel wasn't working.
Right.
But then we got the interview with Karzai, and he got all kinds of access because this, political operative there, kind of was familiar with us. And but he was a very, he was a very jovial guy who actually was in a hurry, and no small talk with that guy. Just in and out, 5 minutes, it's over. So not much insight into him.
Right. And you mentioned hockey. Did you encounter any other Canadian stereotypes while abroad?
Canadian stereotypes?
Yeah. People say, "Oh, you must be nice." Oh, oh.
Oh yeah, but it's actually quite the advantage when
Right.
you're Canadian, because people actually kind of like you. We haven't invaded anybody really, so it's a big advantage. It is a big advantage.
Right.
That's why so many backpackers and foreign journalists put a Canadian flag on their ear.
Yeah.
It's still true, but the other cliches about Canada is, everybody has a cousin in Winnipeg. And do you know my cousin in Winnipeg? He's been there 15 years. I said, no. I'm from Montreal. Well, I said, that close? It's pretty far. So you get but it's okay, and it's not. I don't want to be demeaning about that. It's just life.
Right.
But it's it gets you into the minds of people. But being a Canadian is a great asset. Well, I remember once, because the Canadian flags. We were in Kabul doing a story on how, because the foreign soldiers there were so nervous that if a car came too close to them, sometimes they would shoot and kill people, right? And it kind of happened. So the National with Peter Mansbridge was in town in Kabul. I was there to do a whole week of programming. So I said, why don't I try to tell you the story of how the taxi drivers feel when they get close to a Canadian convoy, and they get the gun like that, and they don't know whether they're going to get shot or not. So we planned all this, found a taxi driver. I was sitting in the front seat. Alexis, my cameraman, was in the back seat. And I remember I brought a small Canadian flag. So I thought, just in case, I'll just show the flag. And then it dawned on me, what a stupid idea. Because everybody wears a Canadian flag, right? What a perfect, kind of decoy to, So I think if I want to get shot, I'll show the flag. I'll just hit it. But, that's kind of the anti-cliche, if you like.
Right.
But
A big red target, easy to spot.
Yeah.
That's good. One final question, then we'll open up to the floor.
it's like the press. We have press on our list.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes they take it off because it's not protection.
Oh, it's not?
No. Now we're targets.
Actually, sorry, two more questions. Did you come across people specifically targeting press? Like, what were people's perceptions of press in general? Was it like, hey, we want to share a story, or was it more?
Well, it depends on the people.
Right.
Some people like you, some people don't like you, and you don't know who likes you, who doesn't like you until they actually don't like you.
And then you don't know until it's too late and they shoot you.
Well, yeah, it can happen, but before the press was like the Red Cross. We were like, not targets, but now we're seen as foreign agents, and I can see that point of view from insurgents in Afghanistan or other places. If you're accompanying Canadian soldiers and they're armed to the teeth, even if you have press, you'll think you're part of the invading army.
Sorry.
So, the best thing is to try to put yourself into people's mindset.
And then bringing it back to today and the future, how can you say that we could best ease journalism's transition into digital?
Well,
what are you working on as
we're
your group?
trying hard. The problem we have is that you have a lot of old people who still watch TV, and then kids like you guys who don't have a TV. So we have to do everything and do a radio. And in our case, we have actually with all the fake news thing, actually we have increased ratings on television, on radio, and now we're exploding on digital. So we have to try to, but we know that we're into a transition, that this is not going to end, that we have to actually be on all platforms now and transition into digital. And it's amazing how fast it's going. I mean, just in a year, there's 500,000 Québécois in French who have stopped watching primetime television, just disappeared. So we have to take stock of that. But we still have the same numbers on our 10 o'clock newscast as we had last year, actually a bit more. So, but what we do is we try to take the brand of Radio-Canada, which is very strong, journalism, and then make it digital products that actually reach people where on the device of their choice at the time of their choosing. That's a cliche we use now, because people don't consume news in a linear fashion anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's actually quite nice. We have an investigative program called Enquête, which is doing very well, but has very complicated stories, on the Panama Papers and all that stuff. So on the Panama Papers, we had as many people consult our website than we did watch the program. So we kind of doubled the audience, and then the website has a very long tail because you can go there, go back, you can you can read the file there in the order you want because it's all broken up into themes or different parts. So it's a different experience, but at the same time, it's more. You can get out and get more out of it. We have we're also transitioning into a new generation of journalists, people of your age, and we just set up a journalism lab last year called RAD, R-A-D, if you're interested, and we just put 6 young journalists and 6 young people from startups in Montreal, designers and all kinds of stuff. And we told them, okay, you have 6 months to reinvent journalism. Mm-hmm. So, carte blanche. And they actually started publishing some stuff last spring, which is really doing well. Like, we got an average of 300,000 views, and this is just on social media. We haven't done any advertising at all on this. It just word of mouth and stuff going viral. And so it's it's stories that interest you guys from your perspective. But we're also trying to make stuff that will go across generations. I mean, we did a story on what it's like for a young guy to actually see his mother go through assisted suicide. Well, we'd done that story from the woman, from the people who actually wanted to die before. We'd never done it from the perspective of the sons and daughters who stay behind. And this was our most successful story. We had more than 1,400,000 views, 30% of which were outside the country. And this was so successful that we took that story and played it on our national newscast. It was kind of a web design, but that's fine. And so we're trying to make sure that we get the widest audience with new formats, with a new generation of journalists, and actually do some digital versions of our traditional journalism to make sure that the brands of Céline Galipo or Gérald Fignon, our economics guy, who are very strong, you can also have on your telephone when you're going home in the metro or elsewhere.
I suppose in terms of reaching out to young journalists, do any budding journalists have any questions in these last few minutes?
Anybody here interested in journalism? Working in journalism? Yeah. Okay.
I had a question about time constraints, or say the broadcast you get to do or the video you get to make. You were mentioning earlier you like to choose a character as an entry point into telling the bigger picture. Do you ever have an experience where you start telling the character story and then you don't have enough room in the package you put together to tell the bigger story?
Well, you have to squeeze it to make it fit. I mean, you can tell a story in 30 seconds or do an hour documentary. But basically, it's either 2 clips or 5 or 8. it's possible. It's not always satisfying, but kind of gets the job done. Now we're getting into more. We're getting away from the 2-minute news story. We either do live stuff on the breaking news, or we do in-depth journalism and original reporting. And this is a lot more satisfying. So we'll do we just revamped our Téléjournal, which is our flagship, our national, with Céline Galipo last year. And we skip over the news of the day and then do really in-depth stuff. Or we'll say, for example, well, today, these are the headlines, but today we'll start with 10 minutes on the Rohingyas. Because you've heard of these people, well, we're going to spend 10 minutes to tell them their story, tell you their story and what it is about. And actually, we've increased ratings with that kind of program. So we're not always stuck with the 2-minute version of that story you're trying to tell, which is frustrating sometimes.
Yes?
Just building on that question a little bit, in journalism school, we're constantly encouraged to have the person drive the story. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about jumping around to different countries and going into conflict zones and some of the challenges of finding those people.
Well, actually, in some instances, it's easier because you're smack in the middle of people living very meaningful situations. So in some ways it's easier than to try to do a story if you're in Paris and try to find a real person who actually is living that story. And you're so much in basic survival mode in war zones and conflict zones that these people just show up, they're there. But you need a good fixer. And often we try to hire journalists and say, this is what the story we're trying to tell. Do you know where we could find people who actually correspond to that story? And but you spend a lot of time trying to find these people. It's a big, big part of the story. It's just not an afterthought. But having people on the ground who actually work with you and know the terrain is usually the best way. You had a question?
Yeah. So now that we're in this digital age that you were talking about, and the world is more connected than ever before, do you find that foreign correspondents actually going to other countries as a reporter, those opportunities are more limited for people in terms of mobility, and it's replaced by other technologies like drones or live streaming? And do you think that compromises the quality of coverage or the reach?
Well, we're not alone now. It's not that impressive to actually go into places because everybody goes and there's so much stuff happening. There's a lot of noise. Trying to cover the story, the war in Syria from Lebanon is tough. You get all kinds of stuff streaming out. You don't know what it is. You get a lot of people, doing all kinds of stuff. And there are pictures of everything that happens before you can actually report it. So what we've been trying to do now is to, for example, on stories like terrorist attacks, like Barcelona last year, we're spending all our money sending our people to terrorist attacks around Europe, and we at some points we said, well, we get all the pictures anyways, so we'll do the stuff. We'll cover the basic stuff from the studio and just send our people to do in-depth reporting on the situations, which is a lot more satisfying and a lot more, I think, useful. And then, because everybody has the same story, the same pictures instantly, so it's not an advantage to have somebody in the field anymore, just standing in front of the camera saying, the bomb was there, the cops are here, they don't know who did it, and then sign off. So it is changing the way we're doing it. At the same time, the social media is a way of really helping us to have a much closer relationship with the audience, even with the foreign correspondents. Now we'll do stuff like we'll do Facebook Lives with people, with our correspondents, when they're in situations. Very cheap, and then you get really good engagement with people. People that are very happy that they can actually ask their correspondent a question on Facebook Live. So we have all kinds of ways now of having a better relationship with our audience, which I think is good, because otherwise it's so aloof. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Anyone has it? Or not, we can end early.
Sure.
Go for it.
I'm wondering, going back to the story that you were telling about the media owner who is also a crook, but a critic, and your editor sort of saying, like, he can't be a good guy and also a bad guy. How you ended up telling that story or changing his character?
I got a minute more to explain why. Because I was stuck to 2 minutes. I said, I need more time. Give me more time. I can show the nuances, the gray areas, and so. But I mean, I'm being a bit facetious because Fornetter was not stupid. He knew what this was about. He says, I just don't know how we can actually relate that complexity to our viewers. People will not, in 2 minutes, get the whole complexity of the situation. So we agreed on more time and went more into nuances. So. But it's not a precise science, right? Journalism.
And unfortunately, time is the enemy of us today, because you have a lecture.
Yeah, I'm teaching at the University of Montreal in half an hour. So journalism ethics. So that's another discussion.
And thank you so much for joining us. Please.
Well, thank you, and I hope some of you, if you're interested in journalism, it is a great life, and there are opportunities, and it's never been as important to be a journalist than now. We need a new generation of competent, ethical journalists to actually slice through the fake news and all the disinformation and actually tell the real stories of the people who actually, live them. So I encourage you. The boomers are going to leave soon. There'll be plenty of jobs, I hope. So, okay, good luck.
And then being journalism is great for the audience. So thank you, audience. Just like to remind you that we have another panel on social media coming up right after this. And then we're having a social tomorrow night, 8 p.m. at Gertz, if you want to attend, meet all the speakers. Thanks so much for coming.
Well, thanks for coming. Good evening.
You too. You're supposed to like a stagehand. Oh.
Yeah, yeah, here.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming out to the social media panel. This is part of the Tribune Publication Society, the Daily Publication Society's Journalism and Media Conference. This year the theme is Journalism Redefined. How did we get here? Where do we go now? This conference is sponsored by Montreal Press Club, Media at McGill, Cafeteria Lumiere, and David's Tea, though sadly there appears to be no David's Tea left. To start, my name is Jenna. I'm a copy editor at the McGill Daily this year. Today we'll be speaking with Doc Shakira and Edward Rowe, who both own relatively famous Instagram accounts. I encourage you to go check them out on your phones, maybe follow them. I'm sure they'll appreciate it. This panel will last 45 minutes, and we'll have a few 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that McGill University is situated on the traditional territories of the indigenous group. Okay. Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples. We recognize and respect these peoples as the traditional custodians of the land and waters in which we meet today. So a bit more on our speakers. Doc Shakira. Doc Shakira on the right is a prolific Instagram meme trail with nearly 60,000 followers. From fuckboys to feminism, she creates memes which extend beyond social media onto National Gallery walls. Her work is steeped in mysticism and astrology, and spits out serious truths about self-loathing and self-love. Edward Rowe on our left. Edward Rowe is a Toronto-based photographer with nearly 50,000 followers on Instagram. In 2010, he started publishing cell phone pictures on social media and rapidly gained a large following. From skies to cityscapes, his work is self-described as cinematic-inspired imagery. Edward captures the life between cities and people and the curious details between. Now we're going to begin our panel discussion. So my first question is, tell us about your work and what inspires it. Both of you have very different styles and very different images on your Instagrams.
Want to go first?
Sure. Should I lean towards this? Is that the idea?
Is this on?
Is it?
Can you all hear
Okay.
us?
Can we just? Yeah. Okay. Just
Right.
raise your hand if you can't hear us. So my work is primarily inspired by just the real life experiences of women and femmes, and particularly mine. Trying to speak to my experiences, and yeah, that's that's kind of where it came from, just talking about the ways that I navigate the world as a queer Latinx immigrant woman, but using the kind of casual format of memes and internet language in order to express ideas about that existence, and ideas about, I guess, communities that don't always get mainstream coverage, although that's changing more and more, which is cool. But yeah, that's what inspires my work.
My work is primarily inspired by cinema. I really have always appreciated watching films on TV and sort of feeling like I'm delving into a world that somebody created and that has a perspective beyond what I've seen before, or something that's like jarring and interesting and like well lit. So that's what I try to do and show to people in the world by taking like a slightly softer approach to large things like cities or people. Like I try and just show the actions between how people do things and the details of cities that people sometimes miss or they see and they really, really appreciate, but they just don't stop to like notice. I typically do that by just taking photographs of light. I use light as a subject, so I wait for the opportune moment to take a photo of light, similar to how film is lit, and I'm moved through the space that way. That's what I try.
So whether you're creating a meme or taking a selfie or framing a photo of the best light, can you explain a little bit more about your work process to create those images?
For me, it was really important to have it be as stream as consciousness as possible and have it be as easily accessible. And what I love about memes is that anyone can make them. You know, they don't have to be high resolution. You don't have to have studied Photoshop or worked in Adobe Suite for 5 years. You can just make one on your phone. And I found so much power in that. And they're they're this internet currency of communication. And even whatever your opinion is on memes, everyone who's internet literate kind of understands that language. So that's what I really love about that medium.
My approach to it is literally just like walking around or talking to people, like hearing stories. Like maybe I'll hear like a local musician or something like that, and I want to get to know that person's perspective. So I'll go and talk with them and take their photograph, or obviously shoot the space that they're performing in, or things like that. That's typically my approach to it. It's literally just find and shoot. Like obviously I time my arrival. If it's like a lighting based thing, I have to like worry about the weather and things like that as well. So I'm focusing on those for whatever. And I do a lot of research into finding locations and going to specific places at certain times of the year based on what I think will achieve what I want out of those. But I find my approach to be just super simple. Like I'm just looking for stories, and that can be anywhere.
So going into a more human aspect, who would you guys describe as your following, and what message are you trying to convey for them?
All that stuff.
Well, from what I've learned, my following encompasses a lot of different kinds of people. I actually had a man in his 40s who was doing his PhD at a university in the UK who wanted to do an assignment on me, and he had no idea about anything I was talking about really, or about memes, and he was really fascinated by memes as a way to communicate a lot of concepts that maybe wouldn't necessarily be disseminated through the internet in informal ways. So you have that, and then you have, I think I do have a lot of young people who follow me, like young women, young femmes, and that's really cool and that's really powerful. And creating a community around that, totally, almost inadvertently, has been a really amazing thing to be a part of.
I think my audience is mostly like-minded creatives, or just people that want to look at pretty pictures on Instagram, which sometimes I find to be like really shallow. So I do try and like show people something that's like different than what other people are showing other people. while maintaining the same realm. Some people might call that catering, but I try to cater as little as possible and show people what I think people should be like appreciating more than what sometimes people do on Instagram. Obviously, there's so many niches now on Instagram too. It's like it's not just beautiful photography and travel and things like that as it used to be when I first started. Like that's all people wanted to consume. So yeah, I think my audience is mostly just people that are like-minded sort of creatives, people that want to see the perspective of someone else on the internet.
So each of you is carving out your own niche. You both have unique follower sets. How do you get such a large following? Both of you have thousands of followers. How does that accrue from, say, my personal Instagram account, around 800 followers to over 40,000 reach?
Well, everyone I've talked to who's had similar experiences has a different story. I mean, the common thread of it is virality, right? So you have something, a post or a series of posts or a photo or something that you wrote that goes viral, and so that attracts a lot of people and a lot of traffic to your page, and then I guess people gauge whether or not they want to stay and follow off of that. So that's what I owe my following to, is producing a really, really high output of content. At a certain time, I was posting like 3 original pieces of content a day. And then when, a few of those went viral, like as people came back and saw that I was producing a lot of different stuff at the same time, that's what keeps people coming back. And that's what I found. I don't know if you've had a similar experience, but high content output in a lot of ways does.
Yeah, of course. Viralism is massive. So it's one of the things that has done it for me. In some aspects, some of my images have been put in places like magazines or on walls of stores all around the world. Like I did a project for Ted Baker, and they put my photographs all around the world, which I thought was really awesome. Like in Japan, like what the heck. But also, I started really early on Instagram. I was like one of the first 100,000 people to use it, and one of the earliest people in like Canada doing what everybody does now on Instagram, like basic stuff, like point and click, oh, beautiful tree, or like ridiculous stuff. But it was like you had to use your cell phone. You could only shoot through the viewfinder on the cell phone. And I just like taking pictures. So like to me, it was just like, oh, I'm cool. I'm taking a picture. I'm sharing with my friends. And it slowly evolved into something that's like way beyond that. And it's become more. And then Instagram, because they were a growing platform, they did do a lot of spotlights on people in the early days. They don't do it as much anymore. And they spotlighted me a few times. And then because of that, there was additional sort of virality that came from that. There was like a visual supply company, ViscoCam. They did a number of sort of features on me, and whenever you can get other people or other like agencies to be interested in something that you are doing, you benefit from the idea of their platforms being able to share your stuff as well, right? You're gaining their voice to share your ideas. So I think for me that is exactly what happened, right? I was doing something that was unique at the time. It's not wildly unique now. So it was a timing thing, but they helped sort of balloon the idea into a broader audience because they were looking for people. They wanted people to do it, right? So yeah, that's how. And then you just work hard and post. I used to post every single day too, like literally. Yeah. I used to post every single day. It isn't that way anymore. As I talked about, I'm not trying to cater as much as I used to be at the beginning because I thought maybe it's not catering, I don't know what the word is, but yeah.
Well, yeah, you brought up a good point, and when you have like larger publications and larger entities that repost your stuff, that does bring a lot of traffic to your page, and that's not something you can really plan for. It's just, opportunities come through that, and so that's a big factor as well. Yeah, but that's part of like the total ephemerality of the internet and just kind of the spontaneity of it, and how anyone can slide into your DMs really, and you don't know what that opportunity might hold. So,
and you shouldn't be afraid of doing it in reverse either. Like,
for sure.
Like if there's something that you think is really, really amazing, and like you want to like know more about it, or you think it's just an incredible thing, like don't be afraid to, number one, share that, but also like talk to those people and have something that like is meaningful. Don't just like it, or don't just like, especially on Instagram, if we're just talking specifically Instagram, like don't just like it, like talk and say something that's like meaningful about that thing, because that's more value to the person that has posted that, but it's also more valuable for you because now you've created like a real dialogue with the person that's created whatever it is that you're looking at or wanting to attain to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really easy for like not just people who like are content creators or photographers, kind of live and work on the internet. It's kind of easy, I think, to get caught up in vanity metrics too, and I feel we're all like guilty of it. Like, how many followers do I have? How many likes? Like, how many shares does this have? How many comments? But the quality of engagement that you get is a huge barometer of like, okay, like where am I at? What do I want to put out? And yeah, at the end of the day, it is really about like, okay, what kind of identity do I want to project and why? And like, what's meaningful about this to me? What could be meaningful about this to other people?
Yeah.
Going on with that, how often do you engage with your followers, interact with your followers? Do you respond to comments on your photos? Do you reach out to your followers and post some Instagrammers will do contests or campaigns or a certain hashtag?
Yeah.
How do you guys interact with your followers?
I try to interact as much as I can with the resources that I have. I used to respond to every single comment, and I loved that, and like, that's what everyone who comments on my photos deserves, for sure. But I learned a lesson about just because you're a person who's very visible on the internet does not mean that you owe anybody that interaction or engagement, especially if you're going through a difficult time, or you just had a really long day and you don't want to sort through 50 DMs. Like, that's okay too. And I think for a lot of people, that's really hard to do and they don't want, they care about their followers and they want to engage and they want to communicate. So setting those boundaries has been really important for me. But yeah, I try to engage as much as possible, for sure, and answer like every question, thoughtfully, every message as thoughtfully as I can within my means. So
I respond way less than I should, definitely. But part of that comes from the fact that I used to respond to literally everything. Yeah. I used to talk to everyone, and I used to like really feel like all these people really cared about me. And as time went on, and as I was posting more and more stuff, I was like, people don't really care about me. Like, at least that's the way that it felt. It felt like people cared about like sometimes being noticed. Like, they would comment on my stuff because they wanted me to notice them, which is like fair, but it's also like it feels like non-reciprocal. It feels like as if they're just talking to me to get something, not because they like care about what I've shared or anything like that. And then the other reason is a lot of the time what people will comment is pretty shallow because, as I said, like, I am sharing just like semi-traditional sort of beautiful images on the internet. So people are more likely to just say wow or like beautiful or something like that. And I just it gets so tiring saying like thank you for that, because I'm not like looking for like I appreciate every single time everyone comments, and I actually do like get sad if people don't comment. It's weird, but at the same time I just like I don't know how to like genuinely say like, oh, like thank you so much to every single person that says that's so beautiful, or that's like wow, what great light, or something like that. I'm like, thank you so much, but I don't know, like, yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I don't engage with but on the opposite side, I do engage a lot actually. I follow a lot of people that are not like sort of. I try and do exactly what I'm talking about, sort of in the sense where I follow people that like share their life in a more like real way. So when people comment and people do say things like I'm saying before, where it's like a more genuine sort of comment and things like that, I fully engage with those people. I have conversations with them. I'll follow them. I'll talk to them. A lot of people that I've met on Instagram are some of the more people that are not like, they're just regular people in Toronto. I'm from Toronto, and in Toronto or wherever. So I just met some people in Hawaii. I was in Hawaii, and they were from Norway, and we sort of bumped heads, and like they're just regular people, but they're really genuine people, right? So I think just being like real on the internet and having a human interaction and a human connection and saying more about the thing that you're looking at than just like, wow. Obviously, it's completely different than you because you're putting out like, semi, like, I don't know, philosophical, like humanism, political sort of stuff on the internet, and I'm not quite really doing that. So
yeah, but it's cool to see the different. Yeah, it's cool to see the different sides of that, and I think like regardless of the kind of content you put out, like when you have a large account on a certain platform, there is something to be said for projection, right? So what I've found is a lot of people, and I guess maybe more so because my work is very autobiographical, and I have shown my face, and I'm very open about, and my philosophy behind that as well. I know that no one else could have created this except for me, because it's very personal, so I'm not going to try to hide behind anything. So here I am. But the thing with that is that people do project a lot of their own expectations onto you, and a lot of their what they think that you are onto you. And so I started calling my presence like an extended performance art piece, because when I really thought about social media and about the people that we project ourselves to be online, even if we are striving to be real and authentic and genuine, which I think we try to do, or a lot of people try to do now, it's hard doing that through a medium that is inherently inhuman. It's hard trying to be human through something that's inhuman. Like the pursuit of authenticity in that sense is always going to be inherently inauthentic, and that's kind of like the hilarious paradox of being on the internet, because we still all want to be connected, we want to resonate with this kind of content, we want to engage with each other, and we will keep doing that, as the future goes on and as social media becomes more integrated with, I think, our biology and our psyche and our emotionality and our spirituality. But there are limits to that. So I think it's important to recognize those and recognize that it's always a performance, and that's okay. We all perform in a certain way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to put it, like that it's a performance, because like that is sometimes like what it feels like when you're trying to like maintain an idea of captivating an audience or talking to a group of people that have an opinion of the way that you are. Like you do want to share the things that you are interested in, and sometimes like you'll share something or do something that's like different than what they want, and then you get that idea that, oh, like that's wrong because like they're telling you that, or like maybe they're not physically telling you, but maybe they're not engaging with it, or maybe they're not, those things, and you get that idea that, oh, this is wrong, but then you realize that it's just you, and like you can just do whatever you want. So it's a really good way to look at it as like an art piece, because it's like now this is like it's like a project that you're doing. Like, I like that. It's really cool.
Yeah. And just for, I guess, further reading or consultation, if you guys are interested in the idea of performance art pieces on social media, specifically on Instagram, there's an artist whose name is Amelia Ullman, and in 2011, I believe, like quite early on, she did an extended performance art piece on Instagram, and she became like an influencer, and it kind of documented her life throughout all these different stages, and to a lot of people it didn't, it wasn't really revealed to the end. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Super cool stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I actually created a couple of the memes that were featured in that campaign. So that was a really interesting experience. And a lot of people were super behind it, and I got a lot of criticism for it too, which was really interesting to see. And that was it was really cool actually to see people engage critically and interactively with my work. Like that's why I do what I do, not because I'm an authority on certain things, although people may see me as that, but because I am just a young woman like trying to navigate the world and trying to do so in a way that is in line with her own values and principles and lived experiences. So there were a lot of people who said that it was very corporate and very like exploitative of certain modes of communication that had been originally created in circles of communication that were led by people of color, right, and Black people, and that's like something that's very, very real. And that's something that I've had to confront in my work as well and engage critically with. So that was one big learning that I took from that. And as well, like using using more informal, some would say like subversive ways of communication in order to like aid large corporations. That was another big criticism as well, which I totally see. But then there was a really interesting think piece that was written by a writer from Remezcla, which is like a Latinx media outlet that's pretty well known, and they were defending my use of memes, and they were defending, it was like a whole opinion editorial defending like why internet content creators like from certain communities do deserve to be paid, and it's not on us to judge when they take certain opportunities, right? So take from that what you will.
Yeah, just what I was going to say about that is exactly the kind of what I said before, where, you know, the way that I kind of see that, and yes, you can critique it and say, oh, you're working for a massive corporation, or you're working for like a brand that like doesn't really deserve to have these like things, especially based on, you know, some brands' histories.
Yeah.
They don't have that. They're not allowed to do that. But then you can also just look at it like the idea is like, when it boils down to it, there were just people at Gucci that thought, hey, this is a really cool idea. We really like what she's doing. We want to like accelerate this voice. And it's exactly what I was talking about before, with just like creating a new platform and like using other people's platforms, even if you like aren't happy with the platform, like the sort of context behind the platform sometimes, the platform itself is still really, really valuable. The sort of megaphone that Gucci allows you to throw, you know, at the wall, especially if, I don't know how, like I wasn't on the project, I have no idea, but I don't know how like free they allowed you to be with what you were doing. I feel like that is the positive side of it, where it's like, you're using Gucci. Like Gucci thinks it's really cool, and Gucci wants to like be really cool. Obviously they want to accelerate their brand and grow, and they want to seem niche and awesome, but you're also like getting the opportunity to utilize Gucci's platform and showcase something that's like unique to millions more people than maybe you would have, you know, been able to otherwise. So I think that's like sort of the, I don't know like what you think about that, or if that's like true, or if you think.
Well, yeah, at the time that is definitely one way I thought of it too. And I mean, it was really cool to like, for example, for me, a really big win was seeing the word like Latinx, which is the gender neutral way to refer to people like Latinx ethnicity. That on being on the Gucci website, right? And that being, you know, a really important, I think, discursive moment. That was really, really important for me, and that was probably like the greatest takeaway that I had personally from that campaign. So there's nuance in everything.
Yeah. They're just people too, right? Like it's people. Like you have to remember, it comes down to a human component. Like
definitely,
Gucci can make mistakes. People, everybody. Like there's so many. It's just people.
Yeah, and it's cool that we live in a time where like we can engage with content creators and we can be critical about things, and we have our voices, and we're able to say like, okay, like, you know, maybe I like this person's stuff, but I don't like what they did here, or maybe I really like what they did here, and this is why, and I'm going to write a whole thing about it, and I'm going to defend this, you know, even if this person doesn't think that way. And like, that's the beautiful thing, is being able to like unlearn together and understand things that we didn't understand before with all of this knowledge and information and these voices on the internet.
Yeah.
So your works, whether it be through memory, perspective, or contrast and lighting, seem to bring your audiences into specific campus of Montreal or Toronto, or even internationally, like you mentioned. What are some of your favorite narratives of shared or lived experiences that you've had when creating your work?
I don't really understand the question.
Yeah. It's just
What's a fond memory you have from a specific work that you've created?
From work that I've created? I don't know if I have one specific memory, but it's been really amazing to meet a lot of the people in real life who have engaged with my content and who have taken something from it, or who have something to say about it. That's been the most rewarding part of the experience. And like whether that's in real life, whether it's people reaching out to me and saying like, hey, I've been following you for a long time, and I just wanted to let you know, like, your memes really helped me like beat depression, or your memes really helped me through this really difficult, dark winter in my life. Like, that to me is everything. So that's definitely been the coolest part of it all.
I'm just gonna go back to the Ted Baker thing. Like, I just thought it was really, I just think it's really cool that I was able to utilize their platform again and be able to share. I was sharing Toronto specifically. We did a project. It was about curious locations around Toronto, and they gave me sort of creative freedom. They had a lot of ideas and input that we had a conversation about, but I was able to showcase Toronto in a way that I thought was, unique and interesting, and I got to showcase places that a lot of people, even in Toronto, had never been to before, and then I got to show the world that. So I think, to me, that was like a really sort of fond narrative or memory that I have from doing.
If there's anything you wish people to learn from your Instagram accounts, what is it? We kind of talked about this with the message that you're trying to send to your followers.
I think I'm trying to send a lot of different messages at once, which can be confusing. But one of the main ones is that there's so much power in your personal lived experience, whatever that is. And so if you can find a way to communicate that doesn't infringe on anybody else's, lived experiences and the voices that I think need to be more prioritized right now, like the voices of people of color and Black and Indigenous folks and trans folks, like if you can find a way to navigate that and to support and to listen while sharing your own experiences, and that's beautiful, and you should do that, right? Also, I'm super anti-curation. I'm super anti a certain aesthetic or posting the same kind of content all the time, or posting on a regular basis. I do that for my day job. I don't have to do that for anything else. So that's a big message that I wanted to send from the beginning, that you don't have to, even though we all, social media is a performance through and through, there should not be any pressure to create a certain aesthetic. And there's so much emphasis put on personal branding, I think, and learning how to brand yourself and market yourself. And yes, that is kind of what we need to, unfortunately, all learn how to do in one way or another to survive under capitalism, especially when you're an independent content creator. But pushing the boundaries of what that means and kind of resisting that in ways that make sense to you, and subverting that in ways that are skillful and clever and still allow you to make a living, but challenge a lot of the norms put on content creators and expectations put on them, which are, have a certain aesthetic, have one voice, have one tone of voice, have one look, have one brand, post at the same time, post regularly, post the same kind of stuff, or switch it up strategically, So, I would love for people to be more free-flowing with whatever they do on the internet.
I agree with that. It's not really necessarily how what I share with my audience, but sort of on a personal level, that's exactly sort of what I think. But maybe I just need to be more open with my audience about my opinion about what Instagram is as a platform, which I'm not, honestly. I don't, because I just feel like they don't care, and I just feel like it's going to put them off. So I'm always trying to find ways to tell them in a smaller way. So I guess my sort of thing that I would love to educate people is just pay attention to subtext. Sort of when I I'll share something, and I often say sort of these odd, whimsical sort of things, and they have meaning, behind why I'm saying them, and what my mood and tone of my phrasing is, outside of just them being whimsical and sort of approachable, or a lot of time they're not approachable at all. So, but yeah, just pay attention to the subtext, and there's a lot more to a person in general than what they share on the internet, and yeah.
I think there are going off of that. I think that there are actually so many cool opportunities with more subtle forms of nuance when you have a more aesthetic, curated feed. I also do think, regardless of how I view things personally, I do think there is a place for that kind of content, and there is a different tone of voice that's communicated with that, and I have a lot of friends who are no, this is why this can be cool sometimes, and that can be used to subvert meetings in more subtle ways, and that's really beautiful as well. And also we're all human beings, and we love to look at beautiful things, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So I think multiplicity of narratives and different ways of communicating is what's most important over everything.
Yeah, totally. Just open yourself to ideas and look at all sorts of things. And I think that is one of the great things about Instagram, or just social media and whatever in general, is aside from them now deciding what you get to see and what you don't get to see, but you get to choose like who you're following, why you're following those people, like your little community that you want to build.
Yeah.
And that's what I was talking about, just like being real when you engage with those things, because the other end of that phone or whatever that you're looking at, that thing, that's just literally a person. And if you like, very likely they're reading it, you know, some maybe massive accounts or whatever, like they maybe follow, maybe they're not reading them, but very likely they're reading them and it's affecting them on a personal level. And if you say something that's meaningful or like that you can communicate with that other person on the other side, you're getting through to them, right? Like that's an opportunity to talk to another person that you're following them for a reason, you know, put them into your community, bring them up, bring them together, like educate each other.
So putting it into perspective, how do you feel your work has changed within the last year or so? And do you have any future projects that you're planning on?
Well, my work has changed a lot over the past year. I don't make as much like meme-oriented content on my page, and the memes that I do make are a little bit more abstract now. Also because like in my personal life, I've been learning a lot about listening, and how listening is often just as important as communicating and putting your voice out there. That's holding space for other ways of communicating and learning and filling in the gaps where you don't have that experience, you don't have that lived, that knowledge. That is just as important. And I've just been going through a lot of my personal life, and I took a step back to just really try to inhabit the world of 3 dimensions, because I think when you're so visible on the internet and that's how you make your money and that's how you express yourself creatively and that's where a lot of your communities are, it's where you live. Yeah, it's where you live. Yeah. And it's very easy to get kind of submerged in that in a way that can mean that you miss out on a lot of the more like beautiful analog experiences in life. And I sound like such an influencer loser by saying that, but it's true.
No, it is true. The people is like why, it's like the whole reason like all of these things were created. It's literally the reason is like because people wanted to share those human experiences, right? Like Instagram was literally created because Kevin Systrom was on a beach with his girlfriend and he saw some people taking photographs and he was like, why can't I like share this moment that I have, like whatever. And he called up his friend and was like, I have a great idea for an app. Like, what if I could just do it on my phone? And they were like, wow, this is like genius. Camera phones were just becoming more popular, and that's like why it happened. But it was like to share sort of human connections and human moments. And it's obviously ballooned way past what that sort of ridiculously mundane little idea was of whatever. But it's just, it's exactly that. You know, it's just about sharing. So
in terms of what I'm working on, I
didn't actually answer the question at all. My work has changed a lot. I'm sharing way less of it. Also, I don't really look at Instagram as work. I know that might seem bizarre, but I just share. Sorry, did I cut you off?
Go ahead.
Oh, did I?
It's okay, go ahead.
Sorry.
I'm working on a few writing projects right now, and I'm doing a day job in social media, and I'm also doing freelance social media stuff on the side. I'm also doing a couple of music projects too, which is really exciting. So trying to get off the screen into real life, which is scary but exciting.
Sorry.
All good. What are you working on?
No, I'm sharing less of like my work. I just share like sort of moments and things that I find, and I'm focusing more on like work that isn't on social media. Because I find that to be more rewarding, sometimes long term, and I can share that down the line if I feel like it. And it also is like less pressure. You're not showing it to a lot of people that are following you because of preconceived notions and things like that. So Oh, projects. Projects. Do you have like upcoming projects?
I just mentioned them. So.
I have like a few, but they're not stuff that I want to share. Some of them have to do with like deeper sort of things, but I'm working on them like offline. So I don't know if hopefully they'll end up like a gallery space or something like that. But they're completely different than what I do now.
This is my last question before I open it up to the audience, but and it also seems a little bit too late now since both of you talked about moving away from Instagram. But how do you think Instagram is going to fare in the future when there are new apps like Vero? It's one that I see a lot of my
Yeah, I brushed it to Twitter to just try it out. And I shut down my account after like 4,000 followers because I was like, this is too much. I'm already on Instagram all the time. I don't need to be on Twitter too. But it's really fun. And like to people who can keep all that up, like good for them. That's sick. It's actually an amazing platform for discourse and having conversations. Like it's sick. I don't know too much about that app you just mentioned, but I do believe that Instagram is totally becoming the new Facebook, which is like a human phone book. And, you know, when your grandma gets on a social media platform, that means it's time to go. So, no, I'm just kidding. You can totally tweet at your grandma if you want. But, yeah, everything passes away, especially on the internet. It's so ephemeral, you know, as I'm sure you know as well. And as a content creator, you just kind of have to really try to keep up if you want to, I guess. So yeah, my answer is I have no idea, but I'm excited to see and find out.
I think about it a lot, like sort of what will happen to Instagram or what will happen to like other sort of things. Mostly because like I'm curious and I want to know like where else can I like do something, because like I'm kind of, like I said, like Instagram is like tiring, you know, like it gets stale too. Like people are sharing so much all of the time, and a lot of it is really similar. Obviously not if it's like, you know, like what you're doing. Maybe I'm just not following the right things again. I don't know. But I think that a lot of what Instagram is won't change until the devices or like the way that we're consuming content changes. Because at the end of the day, like an image on a screen is an image on a screen, and it doesn't really matter like what app you're looking at. It's still just an image on a screen. Mm-hmm. So I think Instagram's been around for, you know, a long enough time now that it's sort of ingrained, much like Facebook. Like people hate Facebook, but like, you know, how many people here have a Facebook account, right? Like a lot of people, and they check it pretty frequently, not because like they like it or they're even using it really. It's just because it's like there and it's like attached to your life now. It's been around for so long, and they've changed too, right? Like old apps like that we talk about that died, like Friendster and MySpace and things like that. Those well, yeah, MSN, like those apps, they didn't change as they went with their audience and with their users and things like that. They didn't really have the opportunity. The internet was very young, so they couldn't step ahead of things. And Facebook and things like Instagram, that's what all they're trying to do all the time. Stay ahead, stay on trend, stay whatever. And if they do that and succeed even at 50%, they're going to continue being the dominant people because they've been around for so long. They have the largest audience. There's no reason for people to go look at a whatever. But as VR or other future sort of out there ridiculous concepts become reality, which is again unfortunate because like VR is owned, like the top VR company in the world is owned by Facebook, which is another example of them sort of trying to step ahead of things. But yeah, Instagram probably won't go anywhere, unfortunately. Like Vero, like, I don't know, the CEO, I was reading an article today about the CEO and about how he is like just a horrible person and had like literal like work camps or something like that, and like just decided to pull funding from all his work camps and like shut off the electricity and the like everything. It's just, I think like when I read an article like that, it's like Vero's never gonna go anywhere. Like also, I do think that it's meaningful that people are so eager to jump to something new, or they're trying to find something else. But like I said, an image on a screen is an image on a screen. Text on a screen is text on a screen. Like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat created something new, a new way of disseminating information, and they created a new idea, and that's how they ballooned to become so popular. Because people really liked the idea of having something that was non-permanent. And then as Snapchat has blown up, it's become more and more permanent, which is hilarious because it literally like subjugates exactly what they were. It's like completely wrong. But yeah, like I just think once the devices and the things that we're using change, that's when we'll change. But it's limited too because we're humans, right? We consume things with our eyes and touching and so. Instagram got that. It's like,
Awesome. Okay. I'd love to open up the questions to our audience. Raise your hand and speak loudly.
My question is to Peter. So, when you talk about like, at the beginning, your content is more like stream consciousness based and like trying to sort of relate that as possible.
I don't know if I have one specific answer to that question because it's not formulaic, right? I kind of wish it could be because then it might be a little bit easier. But I mean, all my best content has always come to me kind of like when I'm on the metro, when I'm just walking and it just like pops into my head. I know that's not like probably not a useful explanation, but I mean, when you find your voice and you find your way of relating to and speaking to your own experiences, and it's something that comes from your heart and it's something that is your truth and that you believe in and you put it out there, there's so much power in that. And I do believe that other people can sense that, regardless of whether it's on a screen or if it's verbal or if it's a text-based or if it's on a page, right? So that's, yeah.
So also in terms of stream of consciousness things, you also talked about trying to sort of stay accessible, but like a lot of the language that we might use to describe our experiences, especially like a lot of theories, which is like in our first language.
Yeah.
How do you stay accessible while sometimes communicating a very specific feeling or like experience or like trauma?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. I think the answer to that lies in so stream of consciousness is like right here, and then if you go a step further than that, it's like, okay, how can I communicate this to the world, but in a way that, okay, if one person reads it and they don't derive any deeper meaning from it, but they get a laugh out of it, that to me is almost just as valuable as like you reading that and going super, super deep and coming up with like 4 different abstract, corollaries to what I just said. Like that's so beautiful too. But that's like my aim more and more, and that's more of a practice. Because stream of consciousness is just more like, okay, like this is what it is, I'm putting it out on the paper, this is a writing exercise. But that extra layer of nuance is more of a practice, and that's one that I've had to work at, where, okay, like this person from this walk of life or like this group of friends, this circle can read it and get something from it, but so can this person. And what they get from it is totally different, but that's okay, there's still meaning in both of those things. So that's what I'm striving to do more and more, and that's more of like, that takes a lot more effort and a lot more practice, but it's worth it.
I find it really interesting that you both seem to have had empowering experiences with social media, but it's something that you're both actively trying to get away from at the same time. Do people ever get to a place where digital art is it something that you're like, is it like a stepping stone to physical art?
Where it isn't?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Like, I kind of hope so. I was talking about this with a friend earlier today, actually, and he has this theory of like, we're just going to drive ourselves to social media exhaustion, and one day, like, everything is just going to collapse into itself like a black hole, and we're just going to be like, nope, like, we're done. We're just all going back to like wearing potato sacks and like, making like stone carvings, and like that's super sick because we're just going to be so tired of it. And that makes a lot of sense to me too. And in a way, I kind of like hope for that, because I do feel like we are like kind of driving ourselves in these like concentric circles of like a digital black hole. But I am sort of like a kind of a doomsday pessimist about that. But at the same time, like what is so cool about where we are now is, you don't have to have, and in the art world, it's such an issue of classism and racism and discrimination in so many different ways, where like it used to be that you had to have, build up these connections, come from a certain family, navigate certain social circles, and then get into this gallery, get into this group show or meet this artist. Like it wasn't just as accessible as leaving a comment or sliding into a DM saying, I like your work, right? So in that sense, I think that that's super powerful and has been so important in making space for voices that have been neglected by the art world. So yeah, I'm not sure which way it's going to go, but we'll just have to wait and find out.
I think that's really like sort of important what you last said. Is like I think it isn't necessarily the only, like it's not, social media isn't a stepping stone. Well, it is a stepping stone, but it isn't the only way. Like, I actually think some of the biggest people on social media are people that, like, all they really do is do things in the real world. Yeah, they're just making things. Like, they're literally just making things all the time, and then that happens to be, like, sort of predicate, like, out there on social media, but it's not their main thing or anything like that. And then what I was saying is or what you were saying was like adding voices to sort of smaller communities. I think that's where the opportunity lies in social media. And maybe it's unfortunate that that's like the only sort of way that a lot of the time, but I think it's also like looking at it from like an optimism sort of standpoint. It's like amazing that there's this platform where you can share smaller communities, smaller ideas to a broader platform and realize that those people can, move towards a broader stepping stone. But yeah, like look at like people like, I don't know, like Frank, like architects, like Anish Kapoor, which is he like obviously did the Bean in Chicago, but he's done many works all over the world. He's these whirlpools and just really beautiful physical art. He's massive on social media, not in the sense that he's personally massive on social media, but social media is full of him. And same with a lot of physical artists in the world, especially today. And I think like there's an opportunity to just be making really amazing things that people want to talk about, and that's how you can sort of not have social media be the stepping stone to success and have it be sort of vice versa. Do you, yeah. Does that answer your question, or yeah?
So I actually have like two separate questions for both of you, if that's okay. First one for you. So you were talking earlier just about doing a lot of research into locations that you're going to do photo shoots and like tracking weather patterns and everything like that. So I'm just kind of wondering, like just being a photographer where timing is so key, like have you ever gone out somewhere where you had all this planning and like tried to take every sort of like preventative measure to make sure you get that good photo, and then just have it fall through and then you don't get the photo? But have you ever been like somehow able to still turn it around and still produce content that you're really proud of?
Interesting. So I was in Hawaii recently, and Hawaii is like super temperamental when it comes to weather. And I just wanted to like go to, I'm gonna butcher the name, but it's Honolulu Valley near Waimea on the Big Island of Hawaii. And yeah, it was supposed to be like sort of like overcasty with like a little bit of whatever. And it pretty much did all day was like torrential downpour. And then when it did sort of clear up, it was just sunny, like no sort of whatever. And I guess like what I took from that was just the experience of doing it. And I produced content, but it wasn't necessarily anything that I was like exceptionally proud of. So I haven't really had the experience where I've been like, I guess like when it comes to nature, I haven't really had that experience of that. Sort of because I'm a little bit picky and I want what I wanted. But when it comes to like people or shooting, you can't plan anything around that. And I've had like I went to LA and I was shooting some people on the street of LA, and it was my first time in LA, and I thought it would be I thought I was gonna go to LA and I was just gonna shoot like LA, like whatever. But then I was shooting. I didn't realize before I went how many homeless people and sort of like the disparity of Los Angeles. I know that I knew it, but I didn't know it. So I produce things that I think are personally like really meaningful in the sense that they tell a message about something that surprised me, but also something that people need to talk about. Like, why is like a Blue Bottle Coffee around the corner from Skid Row? Like literally, like why is that a thing? I don't know. So yeah, like I guess in that sense I've produced. But when it comes to weather, like I don't know. It's like nature's so fickle. Like I take a picture of really anything. I guess like nothing like I'm obsessed with or anything like that. But occasionally you're just surprised when you don't do the research. But Honolulu Valley, I was very disappointed with the photos that I made. But the experience was amazing. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, like a big thing that you talk about a lot is like accountability, to your fans and with the content that you produce, and just sort of like talking about including more people's experiences to be more inclusive in what you produce, and like this sort of translates into like the goth chic hero persona being more relatable. I don't know, but I feel like you get a lot of people being like, I think we're we can totally best friends in real life,
It's definitely been a process. It still terrifies me every day that my face is on the internet and that my very intimate feelings are on the internet. But I've also always been a person who has believed in like the power of sharing vulnerabilities, and I've benefited so much personally from people who have put themselves, like writers in particular, who have put themselves out there and who have talked about difficult things. Like I owe, in certain cases, my life to those people. And when it came to a point where I was experiencing so much, like I never had the intention of gaining a following like this. The way that my life has turned out has been really surprising for me. But I just felt I've always believed in that power, and so. And for me, I'm a writer, and so for me, seeing my words on a page has always rendered even my most scary thoughts like less scary and less intimidating, and I'm able to kind of process them more and be like, oh, okay, like that's not so bad. Maybe to some people that's horrifying, but putting it out there has been like very cathartic for me. But yeah, that's what has been difficult, is setting those boundaries. And again, when I was talking about projection and people thinking that they know me, and it's, you do know if you've consumed my content, like you might be intimately familiar with the side of me that I've chosen to portray to the world, like in a certain context, and that's totally valid, and that's so cool, and like I'm so thankful to anyone who is engaged with my stuff in that way. But at the same time, of course, every human being is a human being. There's so many different layers, and what I put out on the internet is evidence. Like some people think it's very incongruous, the fact that I'm an introvert and very private, but have put so much on the internet. Like that actually makes so much sense to me, because introverts have extremely rich inner worlds, and we just communicate them in totally different ways. Like it's not that we don't yearn for communication, it's just different ways of expressing things, and I think there's power in that too. So I like to encourage people to to not think of the two things as totally like alien to one another. They actually make a lot of sense.
Well, also when you're talking about it as like an art piece,
yeah,
right?
For
It's
sure.
like you're sharing an art piece too. You're not just sharing.
Yeah, definitely.
Like you are sharing your infinite, but yeah.
Yeah, no,
That's
absolutely. That's a super good point. And when I started putting out content, like some of the first feminist literature I read when I was in my teens was, a lot of third wave radical feminist literature, and we've definitely progressed beyond that. But that had a really indelible impact on me. And one tenet of that way of thinking is the personal is political, and it can be in a lot of ways a radical act of subversion to talk about things that maybe society or certain powers that be don't want you to, because that'll keep them in power, right? So I was operating off of that. I felt the art practice part of it was very much like I was sacrificing something that was very precious to me, and I was sacrificing my privacy in certain ways because I knew there were other people out there who felt the same way I did. And it wasn't even just that it was like selfless, like, oh, I'm just going to give you all my feelings. Like I have benefited so much from other people sharing their experiences with me, and I have felt, as someone who navigates the world feeling so alone all the time, I can't even express how much it's helped me to have communication from complete strangers who have been like, oh, like I totally also had that random niche experience that you thought only you had. And I was like, oh, sick, amazing, like, thank you. I don't feel like such an alien anymore. And that's an incredibly powerful feeling.
So we're 5, 6 minutes past 9 right now. We can take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Yes?
I'm not sure exactly how to articulate this, but so feel free to answer however you want. I just wanted to continue on the idea of the political angle and the radical politics, because you kind of kept saying how there, on one hand, there is this opportunity to like create your own sphere of influence, or like people following you and connecting and sharing, like as opposed to mainstream getting censored out by an editor or whatever would be normal. But on the other hand, these big like Facebook and Instagram, they're totally corporate controlled. They do ban people for political views.
Yeah.
They do participate in surveillance, and they actually, like, from what I have seen, they actively they block certain trends from happening, and they especially block trends of editor social media networks that are actually open source and decentralized.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you could like comment on that's like a bit meta question of like, well, like you think with all the social media there would be more radical, revolutionary things happening, and there just aren't.
Yeah.
Well, but
For sure. I mean, it's super relative though. Like what we consider like I mean, when we pull ourselves apart from that, like, of course, like, we all exist within this, like, capitalistic heteropatriarchal context that, you know, we all have like a Stockholm syndrome type relationship to, and it does take a lot of self-awareness and criticality to be able to be like, okay, like, I am being radical and subversive, all right, but am I really? And that's totally like, I mean, I'm not claiming to be I'm most certainly not the most radical person in the room, almost ever, and I'm not the most subversive person in the room, and like, that's, I think that's okay sometimes, and yeah, it's tough to say because, and I've always had this really love-hate relationship with mainstream mass media communication, because on the one hand, I think there is so much power in being able to say something that usually doesn't get that kind of amplification on, say, more niche radical channels, and have mass amounts of people exposed to these ideas, whether or not they resonate with them. Like, a lot of people who have reached out to me were like, whoa, like, I heard about certain concepts that you talked about for the very, very first time, like, through memes, right? And, like, that to me is so powerful, like, regardless of, you know, the fact that everything is corrupt, like, Instagram is corrupt, the society we live in is corrupt, like, I see a lot of value in bringing certain concepts to the mainstream. Like, I don't regard the mainstream as something to be totally, like, avoided and denigrated and, you know, cast out. I think it's something that can be used as a tool to bring ideas to audiences that may not have heard them before, right? But yeah, like I said, so important to always have that element of self-awareness and criticality and evolve and like really understand, like, okay, cool, like, even if you think you're using something as a tool to like subvert the powers that be, like, they still have that control over you. Like, that is something we have to live with, and it's, yeah, it's an everyday question for sure. I think it plays a tremendous role. I think it's so important, and like even seeing the way like people younger than me interact with the internet, like people who are in their late teens or early 20s, it's like so mind-blowing. So like even with those few years of separation, there are so many concepts that younger people just take for granted and are like, yeah, like this is just the way things are, you know, that my generation or sub-generation of people has had to like really struggle with to like accept on a wide scale. So in that sense, I think like having so many young people like on the internet, they're all sharing their lives, they're all talking about their lived experiences, and that's just a given to them. I think that that's incredibly powerful, right? Like visibility is so huge. Yeah, I don't know if I have too much else to say about that, but that's what I think about it.
Thank you so much for coming out to the TPS Journalism and Media Conference. Tomorrow night, Wednesday night at 8 p.m., we're holding a meet and greet next year with our speakers at Kurtz. And we'll be serving free food. Come join us to meet hopefully tonight's speakers and a few more who have also presented at other workshops. Thank you again for coming out. I hope you had a good time. Have a good night.
Sorry for interrupting. I honestly didn't mean to.
We handled it.
And then I just was like,
handled it and moved on. It's all good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having
You asked
us.
for questions, and
Yeah, the questions were really great, and it was so cool to be able to talk from two different perspectives.
Yeah.
Like, that's so important, and like, yeah, it's like, is it okay to ask you like?